imagine him constantly.
Is there any truth to the rumor that the horse farm has been sold? I'm sorry, as the working horse. I can't say for sure, but I don't believe so. I heard that John said that some of that's the problem and it's Hungary and even bought the Boy Springs Market.
Well, again, that's certainly not impossible.
Yeah.
But I don't think
I just wanted to think. I sent him a text and said, I heard my shorts didn't come he's interested in the little highlights.
He's a nice guy, but
hey, how's it going? Didn't know you were back there. So you guys have these mics? They are coming.
across the street, yeah. He wants to put.
What's Colonel?
Yes.
Oh, right, like
No, nothing like that.
Yeah, yeah, that would be a restaurant. Yeah.
That'll be fun. It's all
This is the plaza. Here's the plaza. Oh, okay. Uh-huh. Hi, can I slip past your legs? Sure. Sorry about that. Live it there now? Uh-huh. So this is where they were making the cheese.
Oh,
ready? Good evening. I'd like to call together the special meeting of the City of Sonoma Planning Commission for April 26th, 2018. And with that, I would ask the planning director to do a call to order, please. Here.
Commissioner Wellender.
Here.
Commissioner Jansen.
Here.
Commissioner Barnett. Here. Commissioner Corrado.
Here.
Commissioner McDonald. Here. Commissioner Cribb.
Here.
Thank you. And with that, would Commissioner Barnett lead us in the pledge?
Yes. I pledge allegiance to the flag
Of the
United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Just as a reminder, if anyone has a cell phone or other device that makes noise, please put it in silent mode while we're in session. And with that, if there are any persons from the public that would like to give comments for items not appearing on the agenda, this is your time. Please approach the podium. Seeing none. Do we have any changes of order or review of the agenda that need to be dealt with?
Not from staff.
Seeing,
Since we're the only two people here and we're interested in item 2, maybe we could do item 2 first.
does anybody have any objection to that?
No?
I'll have a motion from somebody to reverse the order to moving item 2 up.
I move that we move item 2 to the beginning of the agenda and have the rest of the items follow subsequently.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Done. Late correspondence.
Well, there are a couple of items at your place. We have an email with respect to item number 3. We've got some materials that were generated by Commissioner Barnett with respect to item numbers 1 and 2.
Thank you. If that's all we've got, then we will move to item 2, which is a discussion on the overview of draft downtown parking study and the related general plan policies. And with that, our planning director.
Well, if you want to call it overdue, that's fair too.
Yeah.
Because as we discuss in the staff report that was prepared for this item, a downtown parking study was actually initiated in conjunction with the update of the housing and circulation elements of the general plan, which occurred over 2015 and 2016. So we thought that since we were going to be doing different kinds of traffic surveys, we should also take the opportunity to do a parking survey and develop a downtown parking study. It's just a way of maximizing staff and consultant resources. So the objectives of this study included conducting an inventory of existing off-street parking and on-street parking supply, as well as utilization and duration within the study area, to assess current parking needs and deficiencies and to estimate future parking demand, to conduct public outreach to identify and prioritize parking issues and problems, to evaluate spillover effects on surrounding neighborhoods, and to develop recommendations for parking management goals. So a draft of this study has been completed, and its findings have been reported out to both the Planning Commission and the City Council over the course of the circulation element update. However, the completion of this study has been placed on hold, pending the outcome of ongoing negotiations with the State of California to reinstate a long-term lease by the city of the Casa Grande parking lot. Because the Casa Grande parking lot plays such a key role in both existing downtown parking conditions as well as options for improving parking capacity in the future, we felt it would be premature to complete the downtown parking study prior to the resolution of the lease negotiations. And just as an update, It's projected that the negotiation should be completed within the next 4 to 6 months. Obviously, downtown parking conditions represent an important and ongoing area of discussion that's relevant to many planning projects that the Commission has and will be reviewing. Therefore, as requested by the Planning Commission, we're presenting you with an overview of the preliminary findings of this draft parking study. However, further work, again, on the parking study will not be undertaken until the completion of lease negotiations. So with that, I would like to just provide a couple of slides that highlight some of the key findings. This slide shows the parking survey area, and the surveys were undertaken in July of 2014.
Would, before you go any further, are you sure of that date? Because the report also talks about it being 2015.
I apologize. I believe that this slide is accurate.
Okay.
Within the study area, 838 spaces were surveyed, including 179 parking spaces that are in publicly owned lots. In addition to the Casa Grande parking lot, which has a capacity of, I think, approximately 142 spaces, there's a secondary lot off of East Napa Street that is owned by the city of Sonoma. And field observations were undertaken in addition to these 2 parking surveys at a Tuesday night farmers market on the plaza. So just to look closer at the findings, during the weekday midday period, there was 83% utilization at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, with the highest utilization on the south and east sides of the plaza. During the weekday evening period, that dropped to 68% utilization at 7 p.m., with the highest usage in the core area. And as one would expect, during the Tuesday night farmers market, all of the parking is fully utilized with spillover into adjoining neighborhoods. During the weekend count, the survey showed 93% utilization at 1:30 p.m. and some spillover into adjoining neighborhoods. During the weekend evening period, utilization dropped somewhat to 91% at 7 o'clock p.m. So in this condition, this weekend period, you've got close to 100% utilization in the core area of the plaza with respect to parking, with spillover into nearby neighborhoods. So I don't want to call it a rule of thumb because it's more than that, but a standard threshold in the study of parking capacity indicates that once utilization exceeds 85%, there is a significantly greater increase in people circulating to find parking, pausing to find parking, going outside of the normal area to find parking. It's a threshold that is basically representative of a parking shortfall. And these figures show the weekday parking utilization, a snapshot, of course, and the weekend utilization. And a lot of, well, I shouldn't try to characterize it. I definitely hear from people who make an assumption that the Casa Grande parking lot is underutilized. It really isn't, especially during the summer. People find it and they use it, and you can see it in these counts. Did you want to?
Yeah,
did you have a question?
Interject. I just want to just sort of reiterate that we're looking at data from July 2014.
Yes.
Where real world conditions, probably based on economic growth, Sonoma County tourism growth, a variety of different metrics, the situation is worse today. And so we're looking at 4-year-old data on all these maps and everything.
I don't think I've said anything different.
No, I just want to reiterate that for our huge audience here tonight, that this data is 4 years old, and you're doing the best you can with the data you have, but in my view, I don't think this is accurate.
Well, I would just say this. The data is accurate in terms of when it was,
Of course.
if I could finish.
Yes, you
The
can.
data is accurate in terms of when it was taken. This is a snapshot.
Correct.
I think it is definitely fair to say that, with the increased level of economic activity that's been experienced over the last couple of years, that the parking shortfall, which was documented in 2014, is likely to be even worse today. You'll get no disagreement from me in that regard. But I think that the data is interesting and useful, is that it shows that even in 2014, we were experiencing a parking shortfall.
Oh, I agree. I just want to
Yeah.
reiterate that
Okay.
this is a severe situation in 2014.
Correct.
And
Let's,
it's even worse today.
let's move on and just open questions before we
May
get
I
into
ask a
Oh,
discussion.
I've got a couple more slides if
Yeah,
I could
l-
finish.
As soon
Sure.
as he's finished with his report.
All right. So there was also, as part of the development of this study, an online parking survey that was performed. These are some of the different findings from the survey with responses from business owners, employees, people who work in an office in the downtown, those seeking government services, residents, and visitors. So there was a pretty good response to this survey, I would say, of 461 total respondents. And in terms of the results of that survey, just some of the key findings are that all of the participants, 50% stated that they had difficulty finding convenient parking. And you might wonder, well, why isn't that number higher? And the reason for that may very well be that the parking situation is obviously different at different times of the day. So if you're an employee who is parking in the Casa Grande parking lot and you come in the morning, you're not going to have any problem finding parking. So many people don't have a problem finding parking in the plaza, but that's highly dependent on when and how they are looking for parking. So, of course we know that many people do. In terms of rating parking congestion, on a scale of 1 to 10, among all of the respondents, it averaged out to something like 6.5 to 7, which is towards the perception of it being congested. And in terms of describing the parking problem, those who felt that there was one, the obvious response, of which we received 63%, is that there aren't enough spaces. Less than 20% felt that they couldn't park in spaces long enough. There was limited complaint about not large enough spaces. And in general, I would say that the key response here among those who are affected by and perceive the parking shortfall is that there simply isn't sufficient parking available. And then we've got responses with respect to those who have to park in the plaza over longer periods of time. Do they have to move their car from one time space to another in order to be able to park for longer than the 3-hour limit? And it's interesting, actually, to go back for a moment to this first slide, or to this previous slide. Can't park in spaces long enough. That was less than 20%, and this was taken at a period of time that was after the 3-hour limit was put in. In years past, the limitation was a 2-hour limit. So even with the 3-hour limit, well, actually that matches up pretty well with that previous slide. Less than 20% are saying that they had to move their vehicle or chose to move their vehicle to comply with that 3-hour limit. Very little support for parking meters. That was pretty universal among all of the respondents. Business owners definitely have a perception that was a little surprising and may be different today, in that 70% felt that customers were able to park within an acceptable distance from their business. But of course, if you're having good business, then you might not be that concerned about where your customers are parking because obviously they are finding you. So I'm not sure how a business owner defined this response in their own minds. So in terms of just preliminary observations, the survey results definitely align with the parking counts. Parking perceptions were pretty consistent among all of the different user types who were surveyed. There's there's little support for implementing paid parking. And this responses suggest that parking management may need fine-tuning rather than broad sweeping changes. And by parking management, this isn't about increasing parking capacity. I think the study shows that we need to find ways to increase parking capacity. But this study doesn't really demonstrate a need to make changes such as, for example, changing the hour limit and things such as that. So that just completes this brief presentation. Again, we put the study on hold not because we believe that the parking problem in the downtown area has been solved. We don't believe that it has, but what we do believe is that in terms of solutions, the Casa Grande parking lot is going to be a key element. And in order to move forward on any kind of solutions for increasing parking capacity, we need to know if there's going to be a long-term commitment to keeping that open for general public parking. And we need to know if the city is going to have the ability to make improvements to the Casa Grande lot in order to improve parking capacity. And until those lease negotiations are concluded, we will not know the answers to those questions. So that's the report. Happy to try to answer questions. Thank you.
I just want to get some clarification into Commissioner Barnett's point. In that parking survey, the draft that you passed out, Table 2 there has the 2015 dates listed for the July survey, which I assume is then wrong. It should be 2014.
Yes, I apologize for that.
And then in the public input right beneath that, it talks about the online parking survey. Is that also 2014?
I will try to look that up.
I just want to make sure that we know what we're dealing with in terms of when the data was actually generated.
David, could,
But I mean, if we have some text that's in error, then we ought to make sure that we.
David, can I just get clarification on the boundaries that were established for the parking study? Is that based on like the downtown zoning district, or is it based on a zoning, or is it based on the perceived like proximity to the plaza?
It was based on the 2-hour parking limit, or sorry, 3-hour parking limit. But we also had the consultants look beyond. So that's that count of parking spaces. Those are the parking spaces within the 3-hour area. But the consultants did look out. So that's what parking utilization counts represent. Those parking utilization counts don't represent someone parking in a residential area, you know.
Right. So
those were observed as part of this report and reported on if there was parking occurring in a residential area that was, you know, associated with spillover commercial. That's reported in the study, but those parking spaces aren't counted in this report as part of downtown parking capacity.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Other questions?
I have lots of questions. Okay. David, in doing this survey, okay, if we look at employee parking, when you mentioned that they were a part of what you surveyed, correct? Okay. So how were they set apart in terms of knowing where employees park or where they don't?
I'm possibly not understanding that question. How do you mean in terms
Okay.
of where they park and where
In
they
other
don't?
words, how do you know that an employee is parking at the Casa Grande parking lot or on the square and moving their car every 3 hours, or whether or not they're parking in Wells Fargo parking lot illegally? I mean, how do you know where employees are parking?
Well, that survey doesn't indicate where they're parking. It's an
Okay.
online survey. It reports who they, I mean, it's a self-reporting survey, so if you are taking the survey, you identify yourself. Are you a resident?
So you
Are
mean
you a business
online,
owner?
meaning internet only?
Yes.
And so do you believe realistically that using internet service only, that you're going to get any kind of accurate reporting from employees on parking?
Well, let me just put it this way. Of the employees who chose to participate in the survey, I am confident that they responded truthfully, because why wouldn't they? Is that a complete picture of how parking works in the plaza? No, I wouldn't say that it is.
Okay. And in the process of doing the survey, did you also have the owners and managers of the various uses? Let's say if we just take the town square, okay, just the uses around there.
Bar,
Pardon me?
the bar.
I don't know about the bar, but of all the uses around the town square, okay, if we just took those, of how many employees that they have within that that area in general.
I don't think we have an estimate of that.
Okay. Okay. Even I'll comment on that later, but right now I'm just asking questions, okay? So basically, it's online only. Now, is, from your consultant's perspective, and I notice that this person is not here, okay? Which I think would have been a serious, a really good addition to have, okay? From the consultant's perspective, how honest would anyone be, okay, about where they park if all they want to do is get to a job on time and get home when they leave the job?
Well, I'm just trying to find,
why would they
think of
go
a
online to
reason
tell you
why
that?
someone would take a voluntary survey, identify themselves as an employee, be an employee, and then be untruthful in terms of their response.
Okay, they're not going to
I
take
don't
a
underst-
voluntary survey. I think that from my perspective, okay, and when I first came here, I lived at 245 West Spain Street, which is only about a block and a half from the square. And every morning, and I had no dedicated on-site parking, so I had to park on the street. And if I didn't have my car there by, like, say, 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was dead. It was going to be parked somewhere in hinterlands, because everybody came in, and all they did was get out of the car, and they were single drivers, put on their aprons, and walk to work. Fair enough. Everybody has to work. They needed to get home. I'm not begrudging that. What I'm saying is that I don't think they're going to go onto an online survey and say, I park on West Spain Street or in the church parking lot illegally across the street or anywhere else online. And so you don't know where all of these people are going.
No, I don't. And that was not even a question in the study. The questions in the study were about, can you find parking? Not whether or not it's legal, not even whether or not it's in the downtown. Do you have to move your car? Those were the questions. No, we did not have questions about, are you parking in the Bank of America parking lot illegally?
Okay. The only reason I'm asking this is, so basically we've got a 4-year-old study, and where one of the fundamental keys, which I do believe it to be, okay, is where employees are parking, because that usually is a big factor in parking, in overflow parking, especially into neighborhoods, okay?
I
And so-
completely agree with that.
Okay, so I'm just asking the questions for that reason. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, to follow up on that, and I think that's a good point, does our development code account for employee parking when we, determine how many parking spaces are required for a project? We do for hotels, but anything else?
Well, the parking requirements in the development code, even when they don't specify employee parking as they do with a hotel, are intended to account for employee parking. So that is an intention in the development code. I mean, you can look at the parking standards and question, well, gee, are they effective in doing that? But they are intended to do that. Let me just put it that way. And I would say, too, that there are uses that have, where you anticipate that there's going to be more intense levels of employment per shift than would normally be the case. So, for example, we also have that reference to medical offices. So the hotel, so that's not exclusive to hotels, but the other categories in terms of the parking ratios that are required, they are intended to account for employee parking. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Do you think, am I allowed to ask you a question about the cheese factory?
I don't.
Because we went from a current situation where at high shift there are probably 10 employees to a situation where you're going to have 20 vendors with potentially 2 employees each, and then 2 restaurants with potential 10 employees each. So we're going from 10 employees to potentially 60 employees. And in a perfect world, I don't believe our the parking standards in our development code accounts for that. And so I'm curious how you approach that in that particular project, if you're allowed to discuss that with
Well,
me.
let's just talk about that, not in terms of that project, but
Okay.
a little more generally, because, you know, it happens in other contexts. And any project that could be defined as a shopping center, and shopping center in our development code just means 3 or more tenant spaces within a single building, doesn't have a different parking standard associated with it than any other kind of retail or office use. So, in other words, if you've got a 1,000 square foot commercial building that is one tenant versus the same building area that is divided among 3 tenants, the parking standard is not different for those 2 uses. I think that I would say that the only way that, so that is not captured in our parking standards. The only
Correct.
way that that is captured is through the use permit requirement that's associated with the shopping center, which allows the planning commission to look a little more closely at that issue.
All right, thank you. In terms of, you said earlier that the Casa Grande parking lot is a key to this sort of our downtown parking situation. I'm curious, when you say it's a key, what exactly do you mean? Because from what I understand, at best case scenario, you could restripe it and add 10 to 12 spaces, but in this report, it says at build out, the general plan would require 447 additional parking spaces downtown. And so I feel like while the Casa Grande parking lot is important, it's certainly not the key. I mean, I feel like the key is potentially something else. And so I'm wondering if there's something
Well,
we don't know about the Casa Grande parking lot in terms of plans, like
Well, I don't.
double-decker.
There's no secret plan for the
Okay.
Casa Grande parking lot. The most recent plan that was developed for the Casa Grande parking lot was actually done in. Shoot. I'm going to get the date wrong, so I'm not going to say the date. But in the 2000 decade. We went through this exercise, pretty lengthy exercise, looking at this downtown corridor area from Depot Park to the plaza, including the Casa Grande parking lot. And through that process, just different scenarios were developed for, among other things, redesigning the Casa Grande parking lot to increase its parking capacity. And, you know, that's not a secret plan. In fact, I wouldn't even consider it to be an adopted plan. I mean, we went through that study. It included a neighborhood component, it included a business component, but I don't regard it as an adopted plan for the Casa Grande lot. It did suggest, you know, in addition to, well, it suggested a couple of things specifically for the Casa Grande lot that are just, at this point, they're just food for thought. You know, one is an improved pedestrian connection between the plaza and Depot Park. You know, where to put that was a big issue. Another suggestion that came out of that study was to reconfigure the Casa Grande parking lot to improve its parking capacity. I think that even looking at the paved area, doing that would result in more than 12 spaces, at least potentially, depending on how it was laid out. And a third suggestion was to utilize the kind of overflow parking area, if you will, that's unpaved, that is part of that property that is owned by the state. So does that, even if everyone agreed that all of that was a good idea, and I'm not sure everyone does, and even if that were to be funded and implemented, would that solve all of our downtown parking issues? No, I'm not trying to say that it would. But the Casa Grande parking lot is also important just in terms of what if the state doesn't enter into a lease with the city and chooses to implement a paid parking program? That could have a big and adverse effect.
Which I've heard that they've
on,
thought about.
They have.
Yeah.
They absolutely have. That could have a large and adverse effect on parking conditions in the downtown area, I believe. And I just think that while this Casa Grande parking lot, and I'm sorry if I overhyped it, isn't like the solution to every problem, it's a big issue. And it's a big enough issue that it's hard to make decisions about where to go in terms of where to put your resources for improvements, that we really need an answer to that question to move forward effectively.
I have a, oh,
Let me interrupt. Just for the late arrival, we have switched the order of the agenda so that we have not heard item 1 yet.
a quick question, and I think I'm missing something. Why can't we build a 2-story structure?
I'm going to say that we can build a 2-story structure. I mean, there's nothing inherently off limits about building a 2-story parking structure, but where would that structure be located? So now that becomes then a sort of a different question, because depending on what property you're looking at, you may or may not be able to build a 2-story structure. And I will just go back to the Casa Grande lot. I doubt, and I'm not trying to negotiate against the city at this point, but just it would seem unlikely to me that the state of California, state parks, would authorize a constructed parking structure on that property. I think I don't say that it's impossible, and it's certainly not illegal, but I do think it's unlikely.
I have some questions too. David, on the Casablanca parking lot, when you first made your introductory remarks, you mentioned that employees that were interviewed about coming there had no problems parking there at the time that they came there, correct?
No. I said that I was highlighting a slide in the survey that showed that 50% of the people who responded to that survey said they had a problem finding parking, which implies that 50% who responded to that survey didn't have a problem finding parking. And what I was suggesting is that even though there's a widespread and I think correct perception that there's a parking shortage in the downtown, I think that's actually very well documented. Depending on who you are, what you're doing, and when you go there, that parking shortfall may not affect you. So if you are, and I just use as an example, an employee arriving early at the plaza, parking in the Casa Grande parking lot, you don't have a problem finding a parking space because of the time that you're going there and what you're doing.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned certain uses that, from your perspective, where employees and the number of employees would be a factor in terms of parking requirements, okay? But one of them was not restaurant uses. And let's say, just throw it out, okay, and I don't know which ones, and I'm not talking about any specific one. Let's say that we have a town square restaurant that regularly has 75 people for a dinner setting. How many employees would they normally have to serve those 75 people?
Well, a lot of that depends on their business model. It's very specific to individual businesses, but I would say 8 would be a minimum.
Oh, I would say 8 is very minimum. You know, it's a lot of employees that serves a great number of people like that. And so I guess what I'm getting to is, especially with restaurants, and when you have the kind of changeover in uses where restaurants become a more predominant use than it has been in the past, okay, it definitely puts a greater demand upon parking.
Well, and restaurants have a different parking requirement than retail uses. So, you know, that is,
But it's usually related to seating, am I not correct?
seating is a proxy. We are not able to control in a use permit how many people are employed per shift.
No, but if
Seating
you have,
is
let's say you
something
had,
that we can count and regulate.
if you had an existing restaurant that was to be reused as a restaurant, and the parking, whatever it was that was required in the past, met the parking requirement, okay, as we have done here on the Planning Commission, okay, that would be acceptable, correct?
Sure.
Okay, even though they might triple the number of people that would go through that restaurant at any one time.
All right. The Swiss Hotel could open for breakfast, but they can't double their seating capacity.
Correct? Okay.
I just wanted to elaborate a little bit about restaurant uses, because restaurants, what David was saying is correct. Restaurants have different models in terms of how they serve food, and whether it's a full-service restaurant versus, like the Sunflower Cafe is a good example, versus the Red Grape, where you have two different restaurants. One has the Sunflower, for example. You walk up to the counter, you order your food, you go sit down, and a server comes and serves you food. The Sunflower doesn't have takeout, and it doesn't operate at night. It only operates in the morning during the day. Then you have another restaurant that the Red Grape, for example. The Red Grape doesn't offer breakfast, starts with a late lunch, and offers food services. The Red Grape is also unique in the sense that it is providing takeout. It's delivering pizza, or people are coming to that specific use to pick up food and take away. In one instance, you're able to manage the Sunflower. You're able to manage your prep chefs and the number of people that are getting ready for the day after or the next day. A restaurant like the Red Grape may have anywhere between 13 to 20 employees on site at any one given time, based on whether or not it's a Wednesday versus a Friday, whether or not it's in the afternoon. You typically will see a peak number of employees in any restaurant in the middle of the day, like at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when it's really kind of like our peak time during the middle of the day. And the only reason why I know this is because I come from a restaurant family, and I know how
Commissioner
they
McDonald,
operate.
let me
So-
remind you, we are in a period of questions of staff, and I'm searching for your question.
I was trying to answer Commissioner Jansen's question about
I would
how
ask you
parking-
to hold that till we
Okay.
get to comments, please.
All right, sorry.
Thank you.
I
Any
have
other questions?
just, this is not our, as a result of my ranting the last meeting for the ad hoc committee for traffic and parking, right? That's not this.
No.
We have to put that on the agenda, correct? Do I have to make an motion to do
We
that?
could do that during this discussion.
Okay, great. That, just wanted to get clear.
I'm not trying to cut you off, but I think we have to try to keep some decorum on questions.
Right. I
And
understand.
go to comments later, especially since we have people in the audience that might want to get up and speak at some point in this evening. Any other questions of staff? Now that I've totally shut that down. I'm going to open up the public comment, and we would ask you to speak your name and address.
My name's Katie Bailey. I live at 121 or no, 115 West MacArthur Street in Sonoma. I have a business, Artifacts, on the plaza, and I've been a business owner for 11 years and watched the city become more and more popular as a, it's a destination, it's on the map. And I've also noticed, as everyone else has, that people have been complaining. I've lived here 40 years. They've complained about the traffic for 30 years at least. But it's really getting worse now. And whatever these, I think all good intentions, the traffic studies have been valid, but we're really at a new place and we need to have some kind of very creative solutions, and including things like thinking about maybe putting a parking on the south side of town and shuttling people in. I don't know all the answers, but I think, or maybe even bringing the parking that's behind the Sebastiani, opening that up and bringing an out, including the parking lots behind the Mercado and all that. I mean, I just think that we need to really not just be looking at the number of parking, because there isn't enough parking. It just can't happen. There's not enough but there must be some solutions that you're really going to have to kind of go out on the limb, think creatively, and solve these problems. Because we have now, I think there's 8 or 9 projects. I sent you all a letter about all the projects going on. There's 2, the caboodle, there's 2 on the west side, there's the big restaurant, there's the hotel possibly, there's 2 in the Mercado, there's the cheese factory, there's Castanaso, and if the only thing we're thinking about is Casa Grande, that means that people come from Broadway, they go up Napa, they come up first east, they go to the Spain Street, and they have to cross Spain Street, then they have to cross across traffic to get into Casa Grande, and it's this tiny little road. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's just, right now it's difficult, and think about what will happen when we have the Oxbow there. It's just unworkable, and it's just, so I'm just going to encourage you to think very, very, very creatively and really research what other little towns have done. Other people have done it. Sometimes it's difficult. You have to make decisions that are difficult, but it's very, very, we're at that point where you just cannot solve this problem by adding another parking space, or it's going to take something much bigger than that, I think. And I don't see, we are on the map. And it's going to help my business. The Oxbow's going to help my business. I'm not complaining about it. I'm just saying, once we lose our small town, once people can't park, once they're unhappy because the flow doesn't work, we lose it. And we have it now, but we could lose it. So that's all I want. I just want to encourage you to be as creative as possible, as think way outside the box, because that's where we're at right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments and for coming out tonight. Anybody else care to speak on this item? All right, I'm going to bring it back to the commission. Now we can let loose with comments and discussion.
I would just like to add one
Yes, please.
point, and this is not something that I can guarantee because I can't, but as part of our department budget recommendation to the council, we are going to recommend that there be an allocation to complete this study, and that could include updates, for example, to the parking counts, because we do, again, anticipate that those lease negotiations should be concluded. And I think that while that is certainly not the only solution to be considered, that it is an important factor that we would like resolved in order to move forward. But, we recognize that this is a significant issue for, virtually all city residents who interact with the downtown, and we do want to move this forward. Thank you.
So you're talking about the fiscal year beginning July 1st?
Correct.
Thank you.
I have a question for David. It's maybe a longer standing question over time, and how we looked at parking. In the past, because you've been here for a long, long time, in the past, has the city ever done a study of like available parcels or land that could potentially or feasibly be city parking lots? I know we do have one city parking lot, but has there been any attempt at that in the past? And also, has there in the past been a kind of like an idea floated out there of a parking district where there would be some sort of assessment for property owners to pay so we could purchase property? Any sort of like discussion about that at all, and whether or not people had thumbs up or thumbs down?
Okay, so to try to take them one by one, we've definitely done property surveys within the downtown over the years to try to identify opportunities to increase parking capacity. Most of the spaces that are suitable for parking are actually in use as parking, and that's been kind of another consideration. Is there any way to share or extend the use of existing private parking spaces? I mean, someone mentioned the Bank of America parking lot, which is probably underutilized for much of the time, but it's difficult to get property owners to enter into agreements that they might perceive as increasing their liabilities. So, you know, efforts like that, frankly, haven't gotten very far. We have not, to date, looked at the concept of off-site locations. By off-site, meaning, for example, south of town. So that's a new idea that could be considered and investigated. In the past, the city has leased the Casa Grande parking lot. The city has put in money to improving the Casa Grande parking lot, and the city acquired that area that was developed as parking off of East Napa Street. So those have been kind of the major initiatives that have been undertaken by the city. With the loss of redevelopment, that definitely complicates any effort to develop new parking or acquire sites for new parking. So a parking district would certainly be one way to help support such measures. I am not aware of any serious proposal that has ever been made to establish such a district in downtown Sonoma, which is not to say that can't happen. It's just that I don't believe that it ever has been pursued in any kind of serious way in the past.
And you made a definite statement that people definitely had a thumbs down for metered parking. But you haven't had any sort of feedback from people about creating a district itself. That could theoretically include metered parking, but that would be one component of a district, not.
Well, that kind of, to make that assessment in terms of interest, that would be a much more specific kind of survey that would be focused on property owners.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're the ones who would be paying that assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Although, in fairness, there might be other ways to generate money for parking that are different from a parking assessment and metered parking. So those aren't the only options.
Right. Okay, thank you.
May I ask a question?
You can even have a discussion.
Okay, David, has there been any attempt on the part of the staff or the Chamber of Commerce or the the Business Bureau, the Visitors Bureau, has there been any attempt to try and have either the owners, the managers of people who employ people downtown to manage, to take care of their, the properties that they're selling things out of or serving, okay? To provide parking for their employees by paying them? In other words, like any kind of bus chips or anything else where they actually provide them, not suggest that they do it, because that's not going to happen, okay? But actually provide them, or provide a place where that's where they're required to park?
Not in such a formal manner. I mean, informally, the strategy has been, well, I mean, to the extent that we used to lease the Casa Grande parking lot, let's keep that as all-day parking. We've got timed parking around the square, so the idea is that that differential would encourage employees to make use of the Casa Grande parking lot without it being a requirement on anybody's part, or even part of a program, if you will. It's just, you know, a really basic kind of incentive. So, no, apart from that, just kind of overall strategy, there's no organized program for different kinds of
Okay,
for implementing different kinds of parking management or practices among plaza employees or businesses.
Okay, currently, but that doesn't mean
Right.
it couldn't.
No, it doesn't mean it couldn't.
Okay, all right, then the second question is, on the Casa Grande, if the state so chose, and if we were to, if you'll pardon my expression, kind of roll over on that issue, hopefully we won't, to require payment, would that not curtail a number of parking spaces that employees currently use that would push them back out into the neighborhoods?
Well, that is certainly a concern of staff and of the city council, which is why we are engaged in these lease negotiations. We would prefer that that not happen. That said, in terms of rolling over, it's a state-owned property. It is owned by state parks. And state parks, like many other agencies, is looking for different revenue sources, in part to maintain their parking lot, which is fair. It's just that that particular outcome, I think, would be a particularly bad outcome in terms of the downtown. So, you know, we're trying to seek a solution where the state gets the revenue that it's seeking for the asset that it has, while protecting the city's interests in terms of parking.
One last question. Without charging for the parking, what revenue would they get
Well, they would get lease revenue.
From us.
from
From
us?
the city.
Okay, so in other words, they'd up the lease if they didn't charge for parking.
Right.
Can I ask a follow-up on question on that? Are you able to generally give a ballpark in terms of the amount the city would pay the state annually for that
No,
parking?
no, I'm sorry, I can't.
The only reason I bring that up is because I wonder if it might be smarter to take that money we would spend on leasing parking at the Casa Grande, knowing that it will exist, whether it's paid or not, and then somehow financing that payment and developing our own sort of parking structure, or acquiring land, or sort of adding to the parking. Where if we're gonna, let's say it's $100,000 a year, I don't know if that's right, but if we're just gonna pay the state $100,000 a year to maintain their current parking, why don't we use that to sort of finance a parking structure somewhere else for ourselves? And that's gonna, I mean, obviously it's gonna take some money to acquire the land and puts, you know, some of the initial costs, but they will always have that parking lot. We could potentially develop a new parking lot with the same money we're gonna be paying the state.
Well, I would just put it this way. Yeah, no, I get that, but I would just say that I don't want to attach any kind of number to what we're talking about with the state, but I would just say this, that number is not something that would preclude the idea that you just raised.
May I?
Yeah, you may.
I'd kind of like to just jump in here and maybe not exactly turn the discussion on its head, but it seems to me that everything we're talking about is coming from a premise that parking will be plentiful and free. And I just think that's unrealistic, and I think it's not where most of the rest of the state is going, probably where most of the rest of the world is either already gone or not going. is away from this notion that there's going to be free and plentiful parking. Because, I mean, that just doesn't make good environmental sense. I was reading, in just doing kind of my background on this, a statistic that, I forget, I think it was in an article in Mother Jones, so you got to tamp it down a little bit since it was Mother Jones maybe, but in that article it mentioned the fact that most vehicles sit 95% of their time, so they essentially, or their parked life is 95% of the time. So, you know, we build a lot of space to have this inert object. And it seems to be that's a direction we're moving away from, you know, in a broad sense. But just to kind of come back to this idea that we're going to have free and plentiful parking. And, you know, I appreciate, you know, Commissioner Barnett's observation. You know, this data is old, but they projected forward in saying, I think the future projection is, what, 400 and something parking spaces. One of the things that was in the study done then, which I think still has some validity today, and I certainly know it's being used elsewhere, is the whole idea of private-public partnerships. So you take these underutilized resources, other people's parking, like the Bank of America parking lot, and that de facto happens. You know, I could bet on a Friday night, nearly every car in the Bank of America parking lot is somebody having pizza at the Red Grape. And because nobody's at the bank at 7 o'clock on a Friday night because the bank's closed. And so the traffic consultants identified 300 and something potential parking spaces. Okay, that's almost 3/4 of the 400 and something shortfall going in the future. I looked at another resource and just using my Google Maps and counting, and I looked at the churches that were within relatively normal walking distance of the plaza, the Methodist Church, the First Congregation Church, the Episcopal Church, the First Baptist, and counted their parking spaces, because if you look at church usage, their hours are largely complementary when you look at when the peak demand is for parking on the plaza, and there's about 200 parking spaces. So there's over 500 parking spaces that exist within a relatively short walk of the plaza that we don't have to build a garage, we don't have to acquire new land, we simply have to negotiate some new leases, which will cost some money, and I don't think it's unreasonable to expect people to pay for a resource that they're using. I think most people, you know, I mean, yeah, if you ask somebody, would you rather have this for free or would you rather pay me $5 for it? Well, yeah, I'll take it for free for sure. But you don't walk into the Sunflower Cafe and say, hey, you know, I'd like a cup of coffee. Can you give it to me for free? Because I'd rather not pay $2.95. You pay $2.95 because that's the going rate for a cup of coffee. And so, again, this idea of plentiful and free parking, I just think as a starting point is the wrong place to start. And so it seems to me we have an answer there in front of us. And I haven't even touched on the idea then of, you know, suggested about, you know, somewhere south using the high school, or even going out to, I mean, look at the giant parking lot at Sebastiani Winery. I mean, if you took half that parking lot, that's probably 100 spaces that are within easy shuttle distance. And those shuttles don't even have to be shuttles. I mean, people could Uber or Lyft or even walk. I mean, 4th Street is not that far away from the plaza. It's less than a quarter mile. And that's within what I think, you know, the parking and traffic consultants will tell you is considered a normal distance. So I don't know, it just seems to me, rather than, we're not looking for a solution, we're trying to continue to identify the problem that we all know exists. And maybe we need some refinement on quantifying that. Maybe it's not 440, but I don't know, you know, I don't know what an updated parking study, but I also just think, I guess
from my personal perspective, and I may be now the most unpopular person in town for having suggested that we should not have free and plentiful parking. That, you know, there should be a cost associated. If we want to move people to walking, to bicycles, to other means of transportation, if we continue to provide them plenty of free parking, then they're going to take the cheapest route. And it just, you know, it seems to me that, and you know, and again, varying degrees of, you know, estimates on what the impact's going to be, but clearly already ride-sharing services, car-sharing services have reduced the demands for parking everywhere. And, you know, 2020, 2025, autonomous vehicles are going to be a fact of life. And so for us to, I would hate to see us be saying, oh, well, we need to be getting more or building more or doing more rather than taking what we have and making the best of it so that we can then start to take away at some point in the future much more easily as demands for parking actually should ease in the next 20 to 50 years. I mean, that's just my perspective on this, so I'll step off my soapbox now. Thank you.
Yeah, you may. I'd like very much to kind of continue on Commissioner Cribb's comments. A question that comes up is, do we have an obligation to provide convenient parking for all? And I come from a very biased standpoint, having lived in San Francisco, having lived in the Marina District, having lived with 2 vehicles and only 1 parking space in the garage. I would consider it a good day if I could find a parking space within 4 blocks of my house. So I am struggling with, you know, are we obligated as a whole? And then secondly, what is an acceptable distance? And you may have already answered that according to the traffic engineers of 1/4 mile. I think that this idea of some sort of public-private partnership is huge, and I would love to see the city attorney give some thought to, okay, if there's additional liability on the part of the private landowner, isn't there some way that there could either be some sort of incentive or co-op? I'm even thinking that, would it be too far-fetched to think that a private management company would be willing to step in as a third party and manage the off-hour uses for a fee, and that company takes on a certain amount of additional of the liability that a private landowner might claim? But I think that needs to be part of the solution, and I also think that the employees and the employers need to be part of the solution too. I think that the idea of having available parking is in the best interest of the employers, and somehow there needs to be some sort of discussion to being, okay, what can we do? Can we incentivize our employees to ride a bike, walk, go somewhere? But it seems, I'm getting the sense that all this pressure is being placed on the city right now to solve a problem, when in reality it should be solved by a much broader group. I also found it interesting in the data, it's just that capacity is, I mean, we're considered at capacity at 85%. In our current model, where we have 838 spaces, if we're at 85, that means there are still 126 parking spaces out there. Are we not willing to look for them? And the other thing about traffic, I think as long as the city council continues to identify that the plaza is a pedestrian first safe zone, we are going to continue to see our visitors and guests walk very slowly without any incentive of moving from point A across the traffic way to point B with any motivation. And I think that again is just a reality of the plaza environment. So I also agree with this idea that, you know, think of the other communities that are a great attraction. Is it Pine Street or Pine Avenue and Carmel? I mean, Are there enough meters there? So I, again, support the at least the unrealistic expectation that we need to provide free parking.
Thank you. So I, at least at this point, fundamentally disagree with Commissioner Cribb and Commissioner Wellender, and I do for a few reasons. I think we need to start thinking not only in terms of what our residents expect, but what our visitors expect. And so what do visitors expect when they come to wine country? They expect to come to, or at least their travel guides tell them, they're going to come to this authentic, small town. And generally, when you have that image in your mind, you don't envision these sort of Marina District style parking lots with meters and $20 a day or $5 an hour. You envision a small town. And so to the extent that free parking and sort of a sort of way of life that doesn't look to charge and you at every sort of step of the process in terms of your visit, I think that makes Sonoma not only a more attractive place for people to visit and for residents to visit their own downtown, but I think it also sort of backs up this sort of brand that we're trying to sell to the world. Because I mean, I lived in the Marina District as well, and I never expected, I mean, I would drive around for 45 minutes before I found a parking space, but it was San Francisco. And so I think when people visit Sonoma, which again is supposed to be this sort of pastoral, small town, I don't think, at least in our visitors and our guests' mind, they expect to circle the plaza for half an hour and ultimately, if this comes to pass, pay $20 a day to visit here. I mean, maybe they'll go somewhere else. Does Healdsburg charge for parking? Does Santa Elena charge for parking? I don't know the answers to that. But I think we need to sort of consider how we want to market this and what will, paid parking all over the place, how will that affect our brand? Now, maybe we don't care about that. Maybe we want to become a small sort of urban village. Well, that's fine, but then we're going to have to sort of come up with a new economy, because if we're going to basically double down on this tourism, small town thing, then I think we're going to have to sort of provide parking that goes along with that. In terms of the downtown parking study, I mean, I appreciate the updating it. I think the counts are, as we discussed, accurate for 2014, but I think if you look at any measure, whether it's the stock market or GDP or even just Sonoma County visitor statistics, it's actually up quite a bit from 2014. And so I think the traffic count, or the parking counts need to be updated for that. I think we need to start thinking about employee parking, and I know that our parking standards technically are supposed to take that into account, but I think employee parking might need to be considered in terms of the way we look at it for hotels. I mean, I think that there have been projects that have been approved on the plaza, perhaps in the last 2 weeks, that will stress the parking situation on the plaza beyond what I think even this parking study envisioned. So, and I'm not too worried about it because I actually don't think that project's going to happen, but that's another discussion. I think that we need to start thinking about a parking district. I loved what Commissioner McDonald talked about, and possibly some sort of parking impact fee where, for example, the Cheese Factory project, for example, I believe it was $7,000 a space. In Napa, they charge $30,000 a space. How do we determine what I mean, I think needs to be some sort of nexus study. We did a nexus study for impact fees for housing and commercial development. I think we're going to have to do that for parking if we have a parking district, with the ultimate goal to sort of preserve our small town nature and also provide places for people to park. I think that Mrs. Bailey brought up a great point that the Casa Grande parking lot is a great parking lot, but it's horribly sited. Like if we were all playing SimCity, we would have never built the parking lot there, because everyone drives to the plaza, and you got to go around the plaza, you know, and then you get it. I mean, it's a difficult parking lot to get to, and you've got pedestrians all over the place in front of Mission Hardware and in front of the Mission, and by the time you get to that parking lot, you know, you're home free, but it's difficult to get there. And so I think a parking lot sited south of the plaza might not be a bad idea. I think that in terms of what Commissioner Wellander said, like, is this our responsibility to provide parking? I think at some level it is, not just through the parking standards. If we're going to create more.
Don't forget the word convenient is the description of convenient parking.
Yes, well, at some level, I think it would be nice to provide convenient parking. And I will bring up sort of an anecdote that a business on the plaza, I was looking at their sort of, you know, as a restaurant. I'm not going to say which restaurant it was, but I was looking at their numbers over the last 5 years. And, you know, there were some operational issues, so it's not a perfect apples to apples analysis. But their numbers were going down, and I didn't understand why. And it's a local serving restaurant. They are there sort of for the locals, and it's not the type of restaurant that a sort of tourist or wine country wants to go to. And I asked, well, you know, the economy's growing, and we just talked about the numbers and the GDP and all the visitors. Like, why are your numbers going down? And they said, when the plaza is busier, locals stay away, and they don't want to come down. And we're a local serving restaurant, and there's no place to park, and they just want to avoid it. And so, to your point, do locals want sort of convenient parking on the plaza? I think to some extent they do. I think also the real world implications of entering into agreements with churches and various parking lots that currently exist, I think that's a great concept. I think it's a great idea. But I do think that unless it's signed well, you know, people are just going to continue to drive around, and they may or may not be aware of these lots, and if they're certainly $20 a day, they may avoid them. And so I think ultimately this is a serious situation. It was a serious situation in 2014. It was a serious situation when we got this report in 2016. And, you know, to the extent that we are, you know, and I don't know, I'm not saying anyone is to blame here, but I think it's the Planning Commission's responsibility and the Planning Department's responsibility, and ultimately the buck stops at the City Council to provide infrastructure for a growing economy. And we're not doing it at all. And in the meantime, we're approving, I'm not even going to talk about what you guys approved 2 weeks ago, but it was really one of the low points of the Planning Commission, in my personal view. And we're not providing the infrastructure for what we continually want to do. And so I don't know how what we do about this, but, you know, whether we stop, I mean, obviously we don't want to stop new projects, but they certainly need to be parked. And I think we need to look at the parking standards. Are they taking into account employee parking? Are they taking into account, I mean, are they accurate? There's just a lot here. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation. I appreciate Chair Felder for bringing this up. But I would really hope that this conversation just doesn't stop here, because I think we've had conversations before. We've had a parking study on the shelf for 4 years. We haven't done anything about it. And, you know, the parking study itself, and I know there are reasons for that. I'm not blaming anyone for that. I'm just saying, you know, the parking study, based on 2014 numbers in 2016, says there is a pressing need for the city to pursue construction of a future parking structure or acquire land for major new surface lots. And we haven't done that, and I know there are funding restrictions, and but we can't continue to add projects on the plaza that will demand more and more parking without addressing this first, because not only are residents unhappy, because as I just said, they're staying away from their own plaza, but more importantly, visitors are not going to have a great experience here. You know, I mean, and we have to look at both of that, and we want to provide both a great experience for visitors, a true wine country experience, and I don't know what that means, but in my view, I don't think that means metered parking and daily parking rates and the sort of urban style parking solutions that you find, because I don't associate that with wine country, and the convenience for residents. And so this is a very serious situation, and I hope that we continue to look at it and come up with creative solutions.
Well, and in terms of doing something, the council has been in negotiations with state parks for more than a year now to secure a lease of the Casa Grande parking lot. And again, while not to overhype the Casa Grande parking lot and what it is capable of in terms of meeting parking needs, I would stand by the statement that it is a key factor in how we move forward. And it is established in the circulation of the general plan that that is the direction that the city needs to pursue as far as obtaining that long-term lease and the ability to make improvements to the property. And that's what staff and the council have been working on. Thank you.
And I would just say to that, I appreciate that. I would just say, if we're going to be spending money on the Casa Grande parking lot, perhaps we could use that money to negotiate deals with existing parking lots elsewhere to provide more parking elsewhere, and that parking is always going to exist.
We should be able to do more than one thing. I agree with that.
Since I have this forum, I've been wanting to talk about two items for a while with respect to parking. One has to do with special events that the city, in conjunction with the Visitors Bureau, with the Chamber of Commerce, don't quite know how they're all formed, but you know, the music concert series, the Wine and Cheese Festival. We have fairly large events almost every week or every other week, especially in the summer and fall, that have a significant impact on parking and congestion. And I don't understand why the city doesn't work with the event planners and also with the associations that plan these events, working with a congestion management plan and a parking plan in a coordinated effort. If you take a look at some other cities that do festivals, bluegrass festivals, wine and cheese festivals, art festivals, they work with a company and they have a parking plan established, which they lease temporary parking spaces, like for example, might be at a Safeway or at a church parking lot. And they also have private police officers that do pedestrian and traffic management at key intersections and corners to get people on and off the sidewalks and allow cars to move in a more fluid fashion. And I always just baffled me when I would walk down to the plaza on one of those special event days and just see the chaos on the plaza. And to me, it's like there's got to be a better way for us to move forward in the future and manage these large events and venues better, not only for our own citizens, but also for the enjoyment of the people that are trying to visit and enjoy the city. So I wanted to throw that out in the universe. I think that we should be doing a much better job at that. And I think that with the amount of money that's being brought in by these events, we should be able to extract a certain percentage of money from those events to mitigate and manage traffic, both pedestrian and also auto. So I just wanted to throw that out there. The second thing that I also wanted to talk about is the fact that we have the ability, as part of the traffic, future traffic studies and analysis, is to really work in conjunction with the Sonoma Valley Visitors Bureau and our own chamber, and working with talking to the visitors that are coming to the city of Sonoma and to the valley, and also the businesses that operate here, and really getting a better understanding of really even getting more specific about parking. Where are our visitors coming from? What type of mode and transportations do they use? How long do they stay? Are these people staying overnight? Are they only coming for 2 or 3 hours? Just to get an understanding of the complexion of what we're talking about, the people that are coming to our city, so we can get a better grapple and handle on, attacking the parking problem, and what type of parking we should be providing. And one specific thing that comes to mind has to do with temporary short-term parking. We have uses on the plaza right now that have takeout, or people are only going into a use for a specific amount of time. Maybe they just want to get an ice cream cone. Maybe they're not interested in staying on the plaza for 2 hours. Or maybe there are uses that we've already approved or yet to approve that want to have local serving type of services. Like we were looking at the Sonoma Cheese Factory proposal, and they were interested in bringing in locals to that space and having vendors. One of the ideas was a butcher shop or a meat shop. Well, somebody like me or you or anybody that's watching this may love that idea, but to go down to the plaza and not have a 30-minute parking space so they could just run in and run out and pick up something and go, that's going to kill a business. They're going to just like, oh my God, why don't we have some more temporary parking? So the reason why I bring that up is that we may find that if you really survey businesses and get more refined in those surveys, you may find that that they really do want to have more temporary parking, and maybe that might be a way to better serve the people that live in the city of Sonoma. So those are sorts of things that if we do move forward with a traffic study and we refine our surveys, those are things that I would love to be able to have included. So thank you.
Well, just two quick things. First, with regard to special events, we actually have fewer large-scale special events than we used to. We don't have the Ox Roast anymore. We don't have Salute to the Arts. Red and White Ball is more sporadic than it used to be. So they're far from every weekend, but I certainly do recognize that they have an impact in terms of how people experience the plaza and how parking works around the plaza. They absolutely do. And while I am not part of the group that reviews special events, what I can tell you is that each of those large-scale special events is required to have a parking management plan. So that is a component of the review of every large-scale special event that occurs on the plaza. And part of the issue with that is there's only so much you can do, and there's only so many places you can go. I mean, to take the 4th of July, for example, you're eliminating half of the available parking that is normally there. And you will not make that up. And people will park in the neighborhoods. And that is just a fact of the 4th of July that I don't believe is going to change much no matter what we do in terms of a parking management plan. I think that the idea of providing short-term parking for residents is a really interesting one, and that's even without a survey. I mean, that's something that could just be an experiment, see how people respond to it, So, I think that is a really interesting idea. And just knowing more about visitor patterns and, that sort of thing, I think that can be a component of updating the parking study when it comes time to do that.
Thank you. And just to follow up on this one more time, is that we were talking about in traffic studies that we've looked at development plans and proposals, and we've looked at and accepted higher levels of services at key intersections. And I always wondered if there was a way for our city to mitigate traffic and pedestrian conflict during key peak periods by by the city working with a business association or district to help fund a police officer or a private company to help get people on and off of the sidewalks. And because we don't want an intersection, we don't want a signalized intersection, but if you go to Europe, you go to some other cities, when they have special events or they have like peak periods or in the evening, or they have like a traffic management plan to help people get on and off sidewalks, and to like tell people you got to stop car, let this group of people come by. And we may try to experiment with that. We might find that we might be improving the circulation on the plaza and getting people in and out if we even try it on a pilot basis for a year to see if that improves the situation during these peak periods in the summer and the fall.
Well, I would just say that, again, to seize the 4th of July as one example, there are monitors at every single intersection at the 4th of July, and as a result, just in terms of people crossing the street, it actually is a lot more controlled than it would be under normal circumstances. But if you're talking about just managing pedestrian activity or speed, if you will, during more normal peak periods, just like on a Saturday.
Yeah, every Saturday.
I think that's a little harder to do, but it's certainly something that can be looked at.
Thank you.
Okay. I decided to listen to everybody first. First of all, I want to say I think this is an excellent document. I was very impressed reading it, even though it is 4 years old. I do agree that it has increased exponentially since then, from my own observation. And it does, I find it's interesting that it alludes to, it doesn't say it, but it alludes to that there's a traffic situation also. And I've got it all marked up where it alludes to it. So they're saying that, with the stopping of the cars and letting people off, and I've talked to a couple of business owners, and they say yes, and it happens all the time. So I think that they go hand in hand. And yes, I do agree that Uber is going to be something of the future, and it may alleviate parking, but that's just going to create more traffic. So I think, so here's what I really think. When have I ever held back, right? Okay. And I view my role here as a leader. And I think we are leaders of this community, and that's why we're here. And the city council is leaders. And I think we need to be driving with our eyes forward out the windshield rather than in the rearview mirror. And I'm going to say this, and if anybody's watching, when an applicant comes before us and says that the parking and the traffic issue are our responsibility, I own that. It is. I'm sitting up here. I am part of what I think should be the solution. But by God, if an applicant is going to stand there and bring cadre of people to say, the planning for this is your responsibility. No, if you're coming to our town, you're part of our community, you're part of the solution. Don't put it on my back or yours. I'm very motherly and protective, but don't do that. You've got to be part of the solution, especially if you're going to be part of the problem. And so any new developer coming in, that's what you're facing if I'm sitting here. So I just wanted to say that, because that kind of upset me that we're not all a community working to see this through. At which point, I feel very strongly that we do need to create an ad hoc committee, and it needs to be part of this community. And I think we need a new traffic study, and that this committee needs to identify the parameters. And I've done some research on traffic studies, and they say that an 8-day traffic study is probably one of the best solutions. And we need an extensive, thorough traffic report that is reflective of the worst of times. Because in the easy of times, it's fine, great, it's easy. But we need to be prepared as leaders of this community, and since they're putting it on our backs, we need to be creative, forward thinkers, and drive our cars looking out the front windshield. So I think we need an ad hoc committee. I think it needs to be comprised of members of this community. I think it needs to be part Planning Commission and part City Council. And I think we need to take a good 6 months. I don't think this committee can come up with the solutions, but there are creative ways to come up with solutions from the community. And I think we take that, we look at all of these potential partnerships, we actually, as a committee, explore them and come back to this commission and to the City Council with facts rather than a study, but we have actual hardcore facts, and we need people to roll up their sleeves and dig their heels in and get this done. So I would like to make a motion that we create an ad hoc committee to take care of traffic and parking.
Just before you do that, what kind of composition are we allowed to have in terms of participation from this commission? Can we have like 2 or 3 members from the commission serve on an ad hoc committee?
Well, I think you're talking, I mean, the way it has been described, it would most likely be a Brown Act committee. I think that there is a larger issue to consider before taking any particular action on that motion, but you could certainly, you know, it's within the parameters of the Planning Commission to create a committee. I don't know that, well, let me back up a second.
Do we have to agendize it to create it, or can we create it tonight?
I believe it would need to be agendized, yeah, and thank you for raising that point. But I would also just say, by way of context, that we spent 2 years and $100,000 or more not too long ago updating our circulation element. And that was done with input from the community, from the Planning Commission, from the City Council. I think that that circulation element is a very worthwhile document that sets good directions for the city that are based on, again, community input from the Planning Commission, and ultimately the decisions of the City Council. But is that circulation element, you know, an instant solution to traffic and parking problems? No, it isn't. It can't be. It's a roadmap. It's a set of directions. And that is the roadmap that we have in front of us right now and that we use right now to guide us in terms of making decisions about traffic and parking, including traffic and parking in the downtown area. I think that in order to revisit that roadmap, we would need the council's authorization to do so, because as a staff person, my job is to, you know, support this commission and support the City Council in the work that it does. The Planning Commission's role, as we reviewed in December, is to implement the general plan. We have a general plan. In terms of the Planning Commission serving as an ad hoc committee, I would just say with respect to the general plan, you are going to be on that ad hoc committee, each and every one of you, because beginning in the fall, you're going to be working on an update to the general plan. And that update's going to include the circulation element. And it's going to, you know, potentially include an update to this parking study. And it's going to include a lot of public input. It's going to include participation by each and every one of you, and it's going to include direction from the City Council. So I don't believe that there's a shortcut to that process. I'm not saying that there aren't experiments that can be tried right now, like, for example, as suggested by Commissioner McDonald, and suggested by Commissioner Barnett, and suggested by Commissioner Cribb and others. You know, I'm not saying that nothing should be done while we, you know, endlessly update these planning studies, but if you're looking for a comprehensive solution to traffic and parking and circulation in the downtown, there is no shortcut to that. That is a major concerted effort. So, and it's not an effort that can be undertaken without the council's authorization, A, and B, you're going to be doing it in the fall anyway.
I'd like to make a motion to put it on the agenda to create an ad hoc.
I'd like to second. But we can have more discussion.
Yeah, let's have some.
I would like to have some comments on the parking aspect of what we have before us, correct? Not the traffic issues, but the parking. So when do I get to do that?
Well, we have a motion on the floor now, but
Okay.
we aren't cutting off discussion on the other.
Okay, great.
Is there any discussion on the motion?
To discuss.
Didn't realize we were cutting off all discussion.
No, we're not.
Oh, we aren't, okay.
We are not.
It's just that the discussion now is about the motion.
Yeah, since there's a motion on the floor that's been seconded, we have to either
Okay, well,
discuss
yeah,
the
I would like to
motion
say something.
and act on it, or deny it and then move on.
The reason why I seconded it and support the committee is because I think we need to do something to get the city council's attention, possibly. David says that we have this circulation element, we have this general plan, that's our role. But in my view, and I know it's just my view, this general plan, this circulation element led staff to encourage the approval of a project on the plaza that is going to exponentially make the parking problem worse. And so in my view, whatever we have is not sufficient or is not working. And so what I would suggest is, so we have two options. We can either get going on this committee to try to create solutions, whether they are using church parking lots or doing something as soon as possible, which could also include, by the way, and I'd like to put this in the record, we have a tourism improvement district, a TID, that takes 2% of all hotel hospitality revenue, the TOT. They take 2%, and I think recent projections show that they take in about $800,000 a year, and that all goes to marketing Sonoma. It goes to the Visitors Bureau, and they market Sonoma. And so we're taking $800,000 a year, we're giving it back to the Visitors Bureau, and they're marketing us even more, so next year we'll get $900,000. And it's this cyclical thing where if we need money for parking, perhaps the people, in my view, that are creating the parking solution or problems could start contributing to the parking solutions. Why can't we take $500,000 a year out of the TID? And I know this isn't legal, and but what I'm saying is there are ways to do that if there is the will. And so there is the money out there. It's just there has to be the will to think about it, in my view, responsibly and intelligently. And so that's why I'm supporting Linda's motion. And the last two things I'll say is that I don't think anyone expects to find parking on the 4th of July. We kept talking about the 4th of July. That's fine. The problem is, August 15th has become the 4th of July, and April 27th has become the 4th of July, and September 25th has become the 4th of July. So we need to start thinking about these things. I love the idea that Commissioner McDonald talked about, and I think Commissioner Crowder has talked about this before, of having someone in the intersection sort of directing traffic and pedestrians, because pedestrians are part of the issue. And ultimately, I'll just close with, I think all of us have sat in traffic on Highway 37 for an hour from Marin all the way to Sears Point, and we're sitting there thinking, like, why is our government not taking care of our infrastructure? Why have they allowed this to happen? And to a much lesser extent, but with the same principle, our city government has allowed a parking problem to happen, and I think we have to take care of it.
Yeah, I would like to join in a little bit on this, and this is why I asked what our requirements were for an ad hoc committee, because I would like to stress my particular point of view that there's an urgency to get moving on this and not wait till the fall, till we get into general plan. I would like to see the Planning Commission take a leading role in getting something started, getting the thought process, getting the some initial studies, research, data collection, and make it available to the broader group. So if we can do that without getting into a Brown Act situation,
as a practical matter, the question in my mind is, how is that supposed to work? This isn't an item that we have any budget for in terms of developing new data. I mean, the suggestion was made that we need a 8-day traffic survey. Doing a 1-day traffic survey and then developing the accompanying analysis costs many thousands of dollars and requires consultant assistance. In terms of staffing this ad hoc committee, right now, the projects that I am working on, it's directed by the city council, are cannabis, wine tasting, doing some background work on the general plan, creating procedures within the planning department to transition it to a cost recovery system. We've got a significant number of development projects. I'm not saying that this isn't an urgent issue, and I'm not saying that there is nothing that can be done about it in this moment. But if you're talking about establishing an ad hoc committee that is going to be generating staff work and meetings and consultant time on an issue for which we don't have any council authorization whatsoever, I just question that approach. If you want to send a message to the council, then I think that you simply put on an agenda maybe a somewhat different motion that the Planning Commission feels that this is an issue that requires some immediate attention, and we can talk about ideas on how to make that happen. But I just have to say, in hearing from different commissioners, I'm just hearing a lot of different things. So for example, if one commissioner feels that our circulation element is completely wrong in the directions that it is sending us with respect to the review of development projects, then the only answer to that is to update the circulation element. That is the only answer to that question. If we have a commissioner who believes that we need more traffic counts, the only way to do that is to obtain traffic counts. We need a budget to obtain traffic counts. We need council authorization to obtain traffic counts. So if you are talking about a committee that would be mainly focused on, kind of short-term measures that don't, that can be accommodated or implemented on a quick timeline, that's one thing. If you're talking about rewriting the circulation element, that's something entirely different. And I guess in this motion, I'm not sure what we're talking about. And I have to say that, that obviously is generating some frustration on my part, for which I apologize.
David, I have maybe a different motion. I'm going to throw it out. That, in the past, we had a big issue with the housing issues and vacation rentals, and those were things that came up. And I know that we had a joint meeting with the council about housing. And maybe that's something that we can consider in early falls, to maybe have a joint public hearing with the council and our commission, and talk about the greater parking issue, and get feedback from the public in a venue like that. Not necessarily establishing an ad hoc committee, but creating a forum so we could get better public input and also some feedback from the council, and then bring it to their attention that this is an issue that should be higher on the list of all of the things that they're looking at, which is a lot. That's something we could make a motion on too.
Well, let me try to attempt to clarify some of this. We have a motion on the floor that is asking for an agenda item to talk about an ad hoc committee. I think that would
An
give...
ad hoc committee, forgive me, on traffic, not parking. And these
No,
are both
no.
being mixed up, am I correct? No?
I think it's both. But what I'm suggesting is that that motion is only to agendize the item, and it would be incumbent on the person making that motion to be able to come back and with clarity on what that ad hoc committee would have its purpose and charter. And given the constraints on city council approval or budget or whatever, or staff time, I think those would have to be taken into account. And if an ad hoc committee can deal under those kinds of constraints in the short time frame, then perhaps it has a chance. If it can't deal under those constraints, then it's a fruitless motion.
As the person who seconded the motion, I like what Commissioner McDonald said, and I think perhaps maybe the best course of action that would alleviate some of David's stress is that we potentially agendize that meeting. Have a joint city council planning commission meeting. We can talk about this. We can talk about the desire of at least some of the people on this commission to have some sort of ad hoc committee. And to David's point, it's up to them. And we could all sit around a table together, and if that's what they want to do, then it can all happen then. But perhaps there's some, and why I supported it, as I said, was because we want to send a message to the city council, but we could do that if we're sitting across from them.
Well, if we're only trying to send a message to the city council, do we want to rephrase the motion, or do we want to just take a vote on this and come back with a different motion?
Well, is that, I would take that as an amendment to the motion? Yeah. I mean, I would, and I'm not, I get a little lost here then when there's an amendment. Does the amendment need a second, or is it just need
Well,
discussion to
you can
support that?
offer it to the person who made the motion to accept a friendly amendment, and then it can be the original one.
Well-
Or otherwise, we would have to act on your amendment first and then go back to the original.
Well, then I would suggest to the original that they, to Commissioner Carrata, that she accept Commissioner Barnett's amendment to the motion. Because I think there's also in the, I guess, modern political parlance, there's the optics of this. And I think certainly there is public concern about parking and traffic. And so to not appear that we're not recognizing it and trying to move that forward, I think, as say, sending a public signal to the council is important. I agree with David, though, that really in the glacial pace of government, the fact that we're coming up on this in less than 6 months anyway, but to not start at least putting the awareness of it. So I would like Commissioner Carrata to accept Commissioner Barnett's amendment to that motion.
I'm concerned about time.
Well, that's what I was going to add. I know Commissioner McDonald said something about fall. And so I would just like to at least add to this amendment that I would just like to expedite that as quickly as realistically possible, and I know that's a very subjective term,
Well,
but
that's how we would take it. I mean, honestly, in this suggested amendment, the motion is simply to request a joint meeting of the Planning Commission and the City Council to talk about downtown traffic and parking and means of addressing those issues. And under that motion, we would, bring that.
and how would that be communicated to them? Or would the meeting just be planned? Or would they have to
Well, the
approve it?
council would need to decide themselves if they want to have that joint meeting with the Planning Commission. So, that's something that they would have to discuss as well.
What, all right, so
Now
I'm,
now I'm confused.
yes, and I'm not saying that I want to take the circulation element and redo it. I know that that's coming in the future. I think we need to start to look at the recommendations of this document and start to roll up our sleeves and investigate and gather data, more data to bring back to the Planning Commission and the City Council. Now, I went to that City Council meeting with the housing, and I do remember you asked for an ad hoc committee at that
Ew.
meeting. Yes,
That
you
never
did.
happened.
And I stood up, and I was very frustrated because I had been working in the industry for so long and saw the waiting list, and it was talk, 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 and nothing got done. And I'm not into that. I'm not into having a meeting for the sake of having a meeting. I need to know that we are really doing something. And if it is just sitting down as a committee, an ad hoc committee for 6 months to go over the possibilities and then take it to the City Council and let them run with it, I'm not saying that we're going to say, oh, yes, we're going to take that lot over there and build a 2-story structure. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying is that we come up with a plan to achieve these goals and then present it to the City Council because it's ultimately their decision. So I'm not in favor of the joint committee because I see it as useless.
Well, the only thing I would say to that is, with respect, we can't do any of that unless the City Council approves it. Okay, we have no budget and so perhaps we could meet with them first and appeal to them. It's an election year. Perhaps they're going to want to do something like that this year. And then perhaps you could do that ad hoc committee. But if they don't approve it, we can't do it. So
You mean as a result of this joint,
Correct.
that we create an
correct.
ad hoc committee?
Yeah, yeah,
But
exactly.
I would like to have this meeting. I mean, we've got many projects coming before us, and I think it's really egregious to ask us to be approving projects when we've got these issues. So,
Well, the only alternative to that is a moratorium, which I don't think the city or perhaps
No.
this commission supports. So
but I'll
we just have
go
to move
along with this meeting as long
Right.
as it's in a timely fashion. But then they set up an ad hoc committee, and what are we talking? Another 6 months? And then we're into the general plan. So does it just go by the wayside? Otherwise, let's forget it. I mean, if nobody's going to do anything,
I'd like to throw out just a comment or an add-on to the discussion. I see value in having a joint meeting with the council. I think it'd be prudent to be able to sit in a room and have an opportunity to express our concerns about parking and traffic, and to hear their comments. I think if we're going to go in the fall with an update, it'd be nice to also go in the fall with an update with an understanding of expectations from the city council, as far as, because they are the body that says yay or nay. And so I see value in having a joint meeting. I'm not sure I see the value of an ad hoc between now and when we're actually going to be getting to the update. But it at least would give us some direction and or some priorities or some input from the council on how our eyes should be open as we move into the update.
well, I'll amend the motion to make it a joint committee with the,
I guess the only problem I've got is how do we stress the urgency of having that joint meeting so that it doesn't get pushed down till September or October or
Look,
whatever.
We want you to be here, David.
I think that I'm not trying to be the voice of delay. I understand that this is an important topic that you want to address expeditiously. But I think that it's also important that you just have an understanding of the other issues that are in the mill. And I'm going to get to your question, but all I want to communicate is that for the next 2 months, those agendas are set. So, it's not impossible that there can't be a special meeting, for example, on the part of the city council, but the city council is going to be holding hearings on the budget. They're going to be holding hearings on the housing impact fee. So this does have to fit into this other context. I think that just by virtue of the fact that you're making this motion and saying you would like to do this expeditiously, that's what you're telling the council, and they'll hear that.
Okay. I mean, that.
But I'm just trying to
I
be
mean,
realistic.
I'm asking the
Yeah,
question
yeah.
because
Yeah.
I realize
Yeah,
how
yeah,
full their
exactly.
plate is. And
Yeah.
I'm expecting that we're not going to get there before the fall.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. But, it's not going to happen in May. I can tell you that. So I'm just trying to be realistic. But I think just the virtue of making and adopting this motion conveys a sense of urgency about this issue, because this is the first time that the Planning Commission in quite some time has requested a joint meeting with the City Council. And I think that just in and of itself, that underscores your interest in this issue and your desire to see it move forward.
So as I understand it, the motion is not to agendize a discussion for an ad hoc committee. It's a motion to request a meeting with the City Council to discuss traffic and parking.
That's what I heard the maker of the motion say just now.
that's correct.
Okay. If there's no further discussion on the
There
motion.
is from my
okay, go
perspective,
ahead.
okay. I just want to make the comment that I support any discussion with the city council with regard to parking in the downtown area, because that's what was on our agenda. And secondly, I think it's something that we actually as a commission could be instrumental in helping to partially resolve. It'll never be fully resolved. In terms of traffic, that's a whole different kettle of fish. And from my perspective, I'm not particularly supportive of opening up the circulation element, refunding traffic studies. They're going to tell us the same thing. We have way too much traffic in this town. It's a given, and we don't have a whole lot of control over that. The only thing we do have control over is maybe some of the smaller fixes that Commissioner Cribbs and others here have talked about in terms of downtown parking. I'm very willing to talk about that, but I do not see the benefit in bringing up the traffic issue again, and certainly not in funding any more traffic studies, which will tell us what we already know.
Just to piggyback on that, the suggestion that I made about possibly having officers or people helping at the intersections to mitigate congestion. That's more of a traffic issue, and so I would feel it would be disappointing to me personally, in a broader sense, looking at traffic and parking, but traffic can be defined in different ways, and so just to say limiting it to parking, I don't think we're going to be able to be exclusive, because I don't think that we're going to be able to separate the two, especially at a joint public hearing. But that's just my own opinion. But you are right. I mean, the whole issue about like opening up and talking about further traffic studies, I agree with you there. I mean, because we're going to be doing that anyway as part of the general plan update. But I think it's going to be very difficult to talk about parking without talking about traffic, especially if we want to look at some very simple short-term solutions. I think those things can work independently of having to do a traffic study, because we already know there's traffic. So anyway.
I would just like to add, though, I think if we're going to be doing a traffic study for the general plan, I don't know exactly what the process is. I think to the extent that we get the right data and the right traffic counts, I think that would be important, because the last traffic study I saw determined that the intersections on the plaza were at level of service B, because they were done in November of 2017. So to the extent we could get accurate data, I would definitely support that.
I'm going to call the question. So all in favor of the motion?
Aye.
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 Aye. Opposed?
No.
So it's 6-1. Sure.
I wanted to just throw out an idea, and it may be impractical. I don't think it's immoral, but I've heard Commissioner Barnett express the way our community is being branded, marketed, et cetera. Personally, I could see there could be some value, and I don't know how we could set it up, but I'd like to have a workshop, a dialogue, Chamber of Commerce, Visitors Bureau, and have a dialogue about, okay, how are you selling us? If you're selling us this quaint, quiet stroll in the non-congested historic plaza, well, that may be great in getting the bodies here, but how can we create that image that they're selling? So I think that there could be something gained in just having a little better understanding of how they're spending the $800,000 of money they have in marketing Sonoma.
I have a
great
suggestion and possibly a motion. The Chamber of Commerce meets on a regular basis, and also the Visitors Bureau meets on a regular basis. I've attended those meetings, and I would suggest that maybe one of our council commissioners reach out. We can select a person and have them attend one or more of those meetings, one at the Chamber, one at the Visitors Bureau, and talk about this issue, and then do a report, and then come back to our commission and discuss that at a public hearing. I don't know if that's
And I think they have these reports pre-developed. I mean, I think they give these presentations to other groups, and so they would just have to give it to us.
That would be my suggestion. Invite them to a planning
Yeah.
commission
Yeah,
meeting.
that's a great idea. Yeah.
That's a great idea.
Well, my idea was to go to them and then have them come back to us, but
So we have to agendize this, right, to invite them?
well, that would be agendized, but there's nothing that would stop one of us from going to one of their meetings and being put on their agenda. They meet, I think the Visitors Bureau, I think since there's public funds, it's almost kind of like a public hearing where they have to notice it. So why don't one of us go to that and then report back to the commission?
I would say that there would be more gain if we could have 7 sets of ears hearing their comments rather than getting a report. Not to say that the reporter wouldn't be bringing back valid information, but I think the most effective forum for gathering the information is for them to come here in whatever setup or structure we need to do from a legal standpoint.
Well, let's do that. That's easy. We've got tons of stuff that,
Right, David? You've got plenty of time.
No problem. I'm just going to say we're off topic.
Yeah, I was going to say, I
All
was
right.
just going to ask, are we allowed even to talk about this
Yeah,
now?
I don't know, we're going a little far afield.
But it's traffic.
we just
No.
made a motion to do an ad hoc, I'm not ad hoc, but to have a joint meeting.
Yeah.
We can make a motion to, at some agenda to, can we do that?
I mean, I thought we were talking about I mean, with
Yeah,
the
traffic.
meeting with but are we talking about having the Visitors Bureau here talk to us about traffic?
Well, I think that you would just say under commission discussion, hey, I'd be interested in hearing the Visitors Bureau, hearing a presentation from the Visitors Bureau about their marketing efforts. You can do that at the end of the agenda.
Let's hold it for there.
Okay.
All right, are we still working on the discussion of the parking report? Are we done with that?
We're done with that.
I'm not.
Okay,
Okay.
we're still working on it.
I have the following comments, okay? First of all, I think it would have been helpful to have the consultant who prepared the report available here tonight. I also think that having legal representation to ask questions of for all of these items on the agenda would have been also very helpful, okay? In terms of the overall, looking at the choices on creating parking in downtown Sonoma, basically, there's three choices. You go up in terms of a structure, you go down in terms of underground parking, or you buy property for surface parking, or going up and going down in addition. All of those are extremely expensive options that I do not see the city or the Visitors Bureau or the Chamber of Commerce or any parking assessment district finding the funds for in the near or even distant future. I really don't, okay? It may happen, and that would be wonderful, but I don't see it, okay? And I think that based on Commissioner Barnett's request, thank goodness, okay, it shows that the Napa study on the parking fee for any kind of providing a single space is so undervalued in Sonoma, which I think we discussed at length, you know, in a couple of applications, and certainly one in particular that we received. It's way, way under. It simply won't provide anything, of much of anything. So I think what we have to do, and this is where I think partially you were headed, Commissioner Corrado, if I can, is that we do have to have that discussion. We have to have an open discussion. It should include the chamber. It should include the Visitors Bureau. It's kind of like we're trying to lock the barn door after the horse has been stolen. We have actively solicited tourism. We have actively solicited. Those organizations have, I think the city has, in large part. Is it beneficial from a retail sales perspective, from a revenue perspective? Of course it is, okay? And I think you made that point at the last meeting. We wouldn't want to be a place where nobody ever had a parking problem, because that would be a terrible place to be. So getting together all of these various interests so we can see what, like, I can't recall which commissioner, may have been you, Commissioner McDonald, talked about some out-of-the-box thinking, okay, or Commissioner Cribbs. We need to think out of the box. I'm going to tell you, based on my long-term experience with it, employee parking is key. I don't care whether it's restaurant or retail or office or anything else, it is key. And we do not have any incentive easily on the part of retail owners, okay, shop owners, restaurant owners, or anybody else to really fully divulge the number of employees who come in to serve their establishment at any particular time of the day. You can see it, all you have to do is walk around and observe it. And, you know, they're parking their cars all over residential neighborhoods, they're getting out, they're putting on aprons, they're putting on whatever uniform it is that they have to have. Most of the uses on the square do not have employee parking. So they can't tell these people, go here, go there, or anything else. If the Casa Grande, worst case scenario, were to become a paid parking lot, you're gonna see a lot more of it, a lot more of it. And those are the kinds of things that we have to get at. I believe, as Commissioner Cribbs said, we have a lot of opportunities to start working with some of the existing property owners and existing parking lots that are not being used during key times that we could get access to. I know it's an issue of liability. I know they're gonna bulk, but believe it or not, a lot of them do eventually come around, and there's ways to deal with that in terms of some kind of blanket umbrella policy that the city may help to provide. There are truly ways to get at that, but I see vacant lots totally unused all through the weekend, like with banks in particular, that kills me because they're right on the square, and yet they have these vacant parking lots that we could utilize as a public parking area. The second thing, and it has been done, I'm not talking about things that have not been done. All of these things have been done somewhere else successfully. Maybe not all of them, but in one place, a particular thing did work, okay? But if we don't get it employee parking, we're just not hitting the mark. People will drive around that come in as tourists, and they'll go around the square 3 times to find a parking space, okay? Employees are just gonna get there early enough, they can park and find the right place. And don't kid yourself, they will also move the car within the 3 hours. So the numbers that were given in the parking study, and when I found out it was online, and I did not realize that, but the numbers that are given in the parking study, one is that they're not gonna respond to an online survey at all, employees are not. Secondly, you know, the ability to move is so easy, especially, let's say you work in a restaurant. You just take a 10-minute break and you go out and you move your car. It happens all the time. And all you have to do is just watch it and see it happening, okay? From a standpoint of coming totally from the outside, not necessarily understanding the city of Sonoma in the way that hopefully I will in the near future, I believe that free parking is an essential element of this community. I think surface parking is, I think free parking is. And the idea that, in fact, especially when it comes to like meters, parking meters or anything like that, the cost of actually enforcing those in many cities has become greater than the revenues that they produce. I just think it takes away from what Sonoma feels and looks like to people who live here, and even people who work here, and people who come and visit here. I just don't think it's a good thing to think about right now, okay? The other thing on the parking management plan that was discussed for special events in Sonoma, the planning director, David Goodison, said that they have to submit a parking management plan. I'm quite sure that they do, and I'm equally sure, correct me if I'm wrong, David, on the parking management plans, who's responsible for the enforcement of those parking management plans?
Well, that's going to be a combination of people, but among others, we now have a special events coordinator who works for the city. That's a city staff person who monitors compliance with all of the different aspects of the different requirements that are placed on these larger scale special events, of which there are many. And so that's the person who is, the kind of on the ground staff person who verifies compliance.
Okay. Is it in your experience special events that cause the greatest parking problems, or is it just regular on the day-to-day basis kind of issues?
I don't think that I can answer that question because different people are going to have different perceptions about it. The way I personally look at it, though, is that the number of special events, again, that we have currently on the plaza is less than what it was even just a few years ago. When special events occur, they definitely create a lot of parking demand, and it's kind of a wipeout no matter how effective their parking management plan is. But that said, and here, again, I'm just more or less speaking for myself, I think many residents are familiar with the special events. They're familiar with the 4th of July. It's something that they are aware of. And so I would say that in terms of solving parking issues, my emphasis would very much be on just the day-to-day frustration that occurs on a heavy weekend, as opposed to a special event. You're not gonna, a special event is, again, no matter how effective you are at parking management, it's gonna be very difficult. But that said, I think people can live with the special event parking issue much more comfortably than they can with just, oh my gosh, it's Saturday and I'm stuck again.
Okay, then I'm just going to summarize my comments, okay? I think there is something in a strong role that the commission could play and staff could play, but we definitely need the chamber and we need the Visitors Bureau to be active participants in this. And that is on resolving some of the parking issues. I agree with Commissioner Cribbs. If we put our heads together and if we do some really kind of creative out of the box kind of thinking, there's a lot of spaces out there that we're not able to tap currently that I think we could look at. And I would urge us to look in that direction rather than in the structured or the underground or purchase more property or any of those things, because I think those are just long-term and kind of wishful thinking financially.
I think we're reaching the point of diminishing returns on this topic, so I think I'd like to wind up this discussion if everybody's satisfied with that. Let's move on to item number 1. Do we need a break? 3 minutes.
He's gonna time, he's got the 3-minute timer on. Boy, we do talk a lot, don't we?
I mean, that's what we're paid to do.
Yeah, well, it put me in another tax bracket, let me tell you. I really took it on the taxes this year because of all the money I'm making here. I guess, could we write it off? Well, where's your mother? I need her. Did you ever think of going into that business? Taking over her business? No? Your sister? No? I listened to everything at these meetings. I remembered you sitting there saying that.
Well, that didn't happen, but
I know.
we were talking about also the
Call meeting back to order. We are now moving on to what was item number 1, which is the review and discussion of design review procedures. Staff report, please.
I'll be very brief. This is requested by Commissioner Barnett back in December to look at the city's design review procedures and have a discussion about them. So we provided you with that section of the development code that addresses it. And again, and just this evening at the request of Commissioner Jansen, we also provided you the code section that sets forth the Design Review and Historic Preservation Commission's authority and areas of responsibility as well as the recommended requirements in term, sorry, I shouldn't say recommended requirements, as well as the, desired characteristics of commissioners in terms of experience. The city's process does employ both the Planning Commission and the Design Review Commission, and in the case of projects that are subject to the review of both, the Planning Commission has authority over site plan, building massing, and elevation concepts to the extent it deems necessary. That's language straight out of the code, while subsequent review by the Design Review and Historic Preservation Commission is limited to elevation details, colors, materials, and landscaping, as well as other matters that are described. And the purpose of that language is to make sure that there aren't conflicts in terms of decisions that are made between the Planning Commission and the Design Review and Historic Preservation Commission in the review of projects that go before both of them. As stated in the brief memo that we provided, any significant change to this process would require direction from the City Council, consultation with the Design Review and Historic Preservation Commission, and ultimately an ordinance amending the Development Code.
Okay, and so in deference to Commissioner Barnett, who asked for this item to be agendized, I'm going to let you lead off the discussion.
Thank you, Chair Felder. I appreciate us taking a few minutes here to discuss this. I appreciate, David, you putting this on the agenda. I am fully aware that this is just the beginning of a conversation that will probably take, if it is to continue, a long time. So I am fully aware of that situation, and I have no expectation that the municipal code or this process is going to change this year, perhaps next year. But I served on the Design Review Commission for almost 8 years. I know that Commissioner Cribb and Commissioner McDonald also served on the Design Review Commission, have a lot of experience with that. And I remember at the time thinking, when I was on the Design Review Commission, that there seemed to be a sort of problem with the process, because the Planning Commission will get a project first, and they will, as David described, approve building elevations and massing and the site design, the layout, et cetera. And so by the time it gets to the Design Review Commission, if we want to make significant changes to what you would consider the design of the project, you can't. And you're really constrained with what you can do. And so ultimately you can really only decide paint colors and potential materials for the project. And I don't think, in my view, so there are two problems here. One, I think it's an ineffective process, because I think design, whether it's the architectural design or the materials or the even something as potentially, I don't want to say trivial, but inconsequential as paint colors, I think that's an important part of the overall project. And I think that needs to be considered when you're making planning decisions. And quite frankly, they often are. Just look at the Altamira Apartments. That was before I was on the Planning Commission. But design issues were an important part of the discussion topic with the Planning Commission. But it was decided, as often is decided, well, we'll just let Design Review do that. And then by the time it gets Design Review, an appeal, and 5 to 6 months later, it was basically, it was very similar to what was presented at the Planning Commission. And the reasons why not all the suggestions were taken into account, they had legitimate reasons. But now you're before a new body that may or may not have the same issues or concerns. And so In my view, that's ineffective if our goal is to make, is to encourage and approve the best projects possible to stand the test of time in our town. I think when it comes to design, we should have the same people sort of looking at it. I think it's also inefficient because I think when you get a planning commission approval, you've got 95% of your approval. I mean, and basically you're done. It's a rubber stamp. I mean, you'll figure something out at design review, where in my view, your planning commission approval should be your last approval. And so I think there's a disjointed system that for projects that come before both planning commission and design review, you have sort of two people doing design, and it's sort of divided up, but not really. But I mean, it's sort of a disjointed system, and so I think that creates a less effective process and project, and I also think that it lengthens the project, and so. And by the way, I'm sort of referring to this fancy discussion supplement that I provided. I think there are, if it is determined that the process could benefit from improvement, because that's just me sitting here saying that right now, but if others believe there's something here, I think there are three potential solutions. One, for projects that come before planning commission, because design review receives many projects that don't come before the planning commission, that they sort of are the start and end in terms of the public hearing process. And so for those that come before planning commission, we take over all design review authority and you know, consider those issues during the planning commission hearing. And at that point, planning commission approval will be final. It doesn't proceed. Or oftentimes I felt like a lot of the design, so option B would be a lot of the design issues that I thought were sort of critical should come first. You know, those should be sort of done first and signed off on, and the design review commission would offer a recommendation to the planning commission that would generally be accepted. Or, and some cities have this, there's a design review subcommittee of the planning commission that also sees it first, but it's not a design review commissioners, they are planning commissioners, so you have that sort of consistent thread of people looking at the project. And so I think those three options could help improve the effectiveness of the process and potentially approve better projects, and could also make a more efficient process for the developer as well. Because in my view, this isn't just our process, it's, you know, I've seen many times you know, a design review, and I'm sure James and Bob could agree or could chime in. You know, there's a 3-hour planning hearing. It's a long, significant project with many layers, and then they wait, you know, a few weeks to a couple months, and then they get design review, and you know, it's a 5-minute discussion and generally a longer staff report, and it's approved. And so I just, in my view, I think that that's sort of inefficient and a waste of time for them to go through that, because I've actually never, the main contentious issues I saw in design review were with projects that began with design review or were historic preservation projects that would not come before the planning commission regardless. And so I also think that if we're going to open up this design review discussion, which I'm again fully aware will take some time, I think we should expand design review authority, and again, this is not for the planning commission, but for whatever that design review commission is, to look at single family development, fewer than 5 units. I know that there have been, and they do that within the historic zone, but outside the historic zone, there have been new projects in town that I have heard a lot of people talking about, whether we're talking about south of CVS or over on 5th Street West and MacArthur, that have modern design that I actually don't have a problem with, but I'm just saying I know some cities look at 2-unit developments, not single family, you know, so the property owner have the right to do that, but we don't look at any, from what I understand, outside the historic zone from 2 to 4-unit developments, and so I would like to look at those as well as the duplex and associated structures outside the historic zone. We don't have a large city. We're not, from what I understand, expanding our city limits anytime soon, and so I don't think it will be a huge burden to make, look at design. And I'm not talking about single-family design, I'm talking about design 2 to 4 units outside the historic zone. And briefly, just to finish, and again, I appreciate you, us having this discussion, if you look at neighboring cities, many cities like Healdsburg, Windsor, Roanoke Park, Petaluma, Napa, St. Helena, Yountville, design review is part of the planning commission approval and process. They don't have a separate planning design review commission for projects that go before, actually for all projects, quite frankly. I mean, they review everything. And then Cotati, Sebastopol, and Santa Rosa have similar systems to the way we have. And so just in the local area, the majority of cities sort of have a more streamlined process. And those are my general thoughts, and I'm really curious to see what others think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelso. I think at this point, rather than just opening up for questions, I'm going to invite the public, if you have comments, Patricia, that you would like to share with us at this time, rather than keep you waiting for another interminable amount of time. And then we can discuss it and ask questions as we see fit.
No, can we wait? Because I'm
w-
trying to find. I'm
All
trying
right.
to find something.
All right,
Thank you.
I'll give you a chance. So any questions or of either staff or of Commissioner Barnett, or we can start it into a discussion?
I just have a quick question of David. David, what is the current criteria and in terms of what, when the council appoints someone to the design review committee, what's their background have to be, if anything?
Okay, I believe I did copy out that section of the
If
code.
you did, forgive me, I didn't.
Oh,
I
no,
didn't catch it.
that's fine.
Okay.
So, but and I've got it right here. Consists of 5 members appointed hold office in accordance with Chapter 2.40. Members of the commission shall include persons who have demonstrated special interest, competence, experience, or knowledge in the following areas: historic preservation, cultural geography, or other historic preservation-related discipline, architecture and architectural history, prehistoric and historic archaeology, urban planning, landscape architecture, or related discipline, to the extent that such persons are available in the community.
Are there any special requirements for particularly licensed people, like a licensed architect or landscape architect?
There are no flat-out requirements, because it's not always possible to, we don't always have applicants who would fulfill such a requirement.
Going to open it up for discussion then for the rest of the commission.
Well, I'll start because Commissioner Barnett brings up a similar frustration that I had on the Design Review Commission, and when it was called the when it was called the Design Review Commission before it was modified. But I think it would be really helpful to have a dialogue of looking at certain types of projects of a certain size and caliber that would be authorized by the Planning Commission and wouldn't necessarily have to go through the Design Review Commission unless the Planning Commission in their authority would refer like final color selection and plant materials to them. Some cities require of a certain size, like any project with 6 units or more, or any project of 10,000 square feet or more of commercial, or any project of a certain size, the final decision is actually made by the Planning Commission as opposed to a Design Review Commission. And in the instance of the Altamira project, as an example, that was a fairly large and prominent project, and I felt that the final design, the final bulk, the final look of that should have been handled by our commission. And I think that you probably all are aware and probably remember that meeting where I was kind of put on a fence and I was either pushed one way or the other. So I fell back instead of forward, and trusted the Design Review Commission would hone in on that. And of course, I want to go on the public record that I'm very disappointed in the fact that the plans didn't change very much. So, so I agree with Commissioner Barnett that we actually should be looking at this to prevent something like that from happening in the future. And again, I'm going to go and say, like I've said at many meetings, in instances, I think we should also include in our process that projects of a certain size and caliber, certain unit size, certain square footage, go through an independent peer review. And when I mean that, I don't mean like the project's coming before us and said, oh, the peer review says that this project's fabulous. What I am suggesting is a developer presents something and an independent peer review of the architecture is looked at, and we are not looking at a project that complies with that. We're looking at a peer review that is making recommendations for change of that project. So as a commission, we can say, we agree with those aspects of that peer review, and we think that you should go forward and do X, Y, and Z, lower the height, push it back, add landscaping here, and then let the Design Review Commission do the final review of that. Some sort of process like that where we are being able to know that there might be changes that could be made, that the Design Review Commission looks at it, or alternately, we are the final decision makers. Some hybrid or something that looks at the ability to do that of, again, projects of a certain size and caliber. And I'm not saying every single project, but obviously the Altamira project is a good example. The cheese factory is another good example where that kind of a process probably should have taken place. So I'm going to just leave it at that because I don't want to spend much more time on that.
You know, I'll chime in as the other 8-year design review commissioner. I have some similar frustrations, but I think mine were more on the other side sometimes, where I felt design review should have had greater authority in the design review process, because in theory, as the requirements are, they, to the extent that such experts are available within our community, those are the people that have those particular skill sets, whether it be in landscape architecture or design or whatever, which leads me to like option B here, as like have it, the design elements be done before we even see it, so that we're pretty much looking at what is considered a finished product. It's kind of like your idea of a peer, but I mean, let the Design Review Commission sort of act as that peer review. Or if you flipped it the other way, then I would say restrict our review to simply the building envelope, land use and building envelope, and, you know, to, again, streamline the process. But I would say, from what Commissioner Barnett's put before us here, I actually think that the option B, if I were on design review, that's, at the time, I think that's the direction I would have favored, was his option B. So that, and I think it would in part achieve some of what Commissioner McDonald here is suggesting, in terms of having kind of this peer review where the applicant comes to you with a project and it really gets vetted in a design sense before it arrives on the Planning Commission. So that's all I'll say on that.
Next.
Okay. I have my own kind of responses to this. Actually, I was very glad to see this on the agenda along with the other items, because I think it gives us an opportunity to kind of all of us vent our obviously very diverse and differing views on these subjects. Personally, in the short time that I've been on the commission, I found that the level of detail of submittals to the Planning Commission is just woefully inadequate to make a really good decision. I mean, we get so little in terms of the detail of the project. We don't know the color palette, we don't know the materials. They show trees, but we don't know which ones have to be removed, what they're gonna be replaced with. We don't see the street tree planning program. We don't see any of the specifics that really, in the end, define what the project is going to look like. I can tell you right now, where the buildings are placed and what size they are is simple. But all the rest of it is what makes the project and what makes it look good, bad, or maybe somewhere in between. And so I think that's my first reaction to what it is that we have received. Secondly, I think, and to me, the Sonoma Cheese Factory underscored that, is that there's an inherent difference between design review and historic preservation in some areas. And I think an historic preservation review is very, very important. The design review and how it integrates with the historic preservation, I think, was lost on that, okay? And I think all of the commission members in one degree or another really expressed that loss, okay? I think that the educational tools that we've had, you know, for decades now are not utilized here, okay? I haven't seen a model of any project, even though some of them are fairly substantial. I haven't seen a project that's superimposed visually by video, okay, that shows how it integrates onto a site with surrounding uses, especially even on corridors like Broadway or West Napa or any of the other main streets leading into Sonoma, where it's very important what it is that we're going to look at and how we're going to perceive it, okay? I think that even renderings incorporating the surrounding buildings would be incredibly important to do that, so that we have a sense, and certainly the public has a sense, and to be honest with you, I don't count myself as any more knowledgeable than most members of the public are here, of what this really is going to look like in the end. I don't get that we have the information to do that, okay? I think there's a huge gap between what it is that we approve on these projects and what the design review committee has to kind of fine tune in the end. Big gap, okay? I mean, when you look at, as you pointed out, Commissioner Barnett, when you look at the color palette, the building materials, the eave overhangs, I mean, there's so many things that we're asking a committee to kind of pick up our pieces because we see so little of it when we approve this project. So I don't think the system is currently working. I do not well at least, okay? And I don't mean on the historic side, I mean on the design review side, okay? And so I sense, you know, I mean, I share that frustration. Which option is the best, I don't know, and I look to all my colleagues here to help me out with that. But, you know, I've been in lots of cities where they all do it differently. As we know, every city does it differently. But the list that's provided here by Commissioner Barnett is a good list of those that are within, you know, the whole wine country kind of area, and it's probably as representative as anything that we might want to look at, okay? From my perspective, having a subset of the Planning Commission act as design review could be a simple and easy way of getting input, okay, especially from those on the, those on the subcommittee could have a building expertise. I know that we do have people here that have done building at least, okay? I don't know whether we have any licensed people here, but it always helps to have that kind of expertise when you're looking at a project before it comes up before a body like the Planning Commission. Because if we are the final say, absent appeal, that's a big step. And that means that the Design Review Committee has to pick up all kinds of pieces. And I think that's asking a lot.
And just for elaboration too, my frustration has always been not that we're not asking the right questions at our meetings. But the fact is, a lot of this has to do with architecture and design, and none of us are architects and none of us are designers. I've worked with designers. Well, I'm talking about architecture. Were you an architect? I didn't know. I'm sorry.
When you practice for 35 years.
Oh, I'm
with
sorry.
architects,
Okay, so have I.
blind.
But, right, but the thing is, what I've always found a value is to actually have a dialogue. If there was a consultant that was retained by the city, right? And to have the dialogue about, we've had these meetings where we're talking about like, can we lower the height of the roof? Can we push it back a little bit? What about changing the windows or to reduce the bulk and improve the appearance of the project? And it's been very difficult for us to communicate that. And I think our real goal is to reduce continuances and to reduce the amount of public hearings and to be able to refine and hone in on specifically what it is that our commission wants. And so if we are having public hearings where, like the Altamira project, where design was a really big issue, to have a process in place where there is independent peer review that could help guide and make suggestions, so staff members like David could actually write specific conditions of approval and have those in place so the commission can feel comfortable approving those, and maybe go to the Design Review Commission, because then the Design Review Commission would have specific recommendations that would be put in place, and the project would probably be modified and changed, so when it would go back before the Design Review Commission, the architectural consultant would be saying, I approve this project. This is exactly kind of the changes that we had suggested and made, and I endorse this project. So the Design Review Commission then can focus on, okay, great, so I'm glad. We might want to tweak it a little bit, but let's talk about colors and blah, 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 and then they can do their thing. That's just an idea to throw out, but I think that we've all struggled as a commission to be able to give the developer the guidance, like especially for the last three very large projects that we were reviewing.
Now, I want you to go first.
So, I know.
I've got a lot to share.
Okay, put the 3-minute timer on you. Mine's very simple. I support effectiveness and efficiency, and I'm trusting my colleagues here to tell me that it's not working, and so I will believe that. And I actually liked Measure B, where they do the design before and they bring us the recommendations. But I'm here to serve.
If I could steal a comment from my fellow commissioner in the last agendized item, after I talk, I may be the least popular person in the room. Being the only licensed professional designer, and I did sit on design review for 6 years, so I come from both perspectives as well as coming and presenting designs. One of the things that I'm not hearing is clarity on the design process. You're asking architects or landscape architects to detail something that they may or may not get the use permit on. That's putting the cart before the horse. Also, one of the things that I've observed in my 6 years sitting on design review and 2+ now in commission, our charge is not to design. I don't know what it is about, we get behind this podium here and we want to design. That's not our charge. Our charge is to evaluate what's presented. As planning commissioners, yeah, we have enough on our plate to consider context, mass, setting, setbacks. I can't see us adding design review on top of what we're trying to do already and be efficient. We have the propensity to want to make comments about design at this level. You can't ask an architect to design a project, spend hours of of effort, big bucks, and then come before and say, this is complete. Here's my fenestration, here's my colors. I like this kind of windows. I want this kind of shingles, etc. That's not how the design process works, at least what I've been exposed to in 35 years of practice. So I really think that if we stay focused on what our charge is as planning commissioners with the ultimate goal of making a recommendation, is this an appropriate project to be granted a use permit? We've done our work. Then we pass the baton on to design review. I think that they play a very appropriate role. I don't think we tie their hands. They're not charged in massing or scale or setbacks. Yes, they may want to say, gee, that would be a much better Queen Anne Victorian if that roof was just pushed down a little bit. No, that's not our charge. I think that where we fall short is we don't always do a very good job of giving direction to the applicant in the capacity that we have been nominated to perform. So I do not support the idea of adding any more burden. Can you imagine how long our meetings would go if we were now asked to give peer review on design? And I don't think it's appropriate necessarily to, again, bring in another layer of peer review. Again, whether your eyes are professional designers or not, you do have eyes, and you can make a judgment on something of whether or not you think it's appropriate. I would like to continue this discussion about possibly considering keeping the structure, but maybe clarifying the roles so that they integrate well and proper, and that we are working as a machine of two commissions, not one having a hissy fit because, you know, we didn't get to pick the color and they chose the tree and I didn't like the tree, but the garbage cans were really nice. No, that's where the problem is. And again, I'm coming from having been on that side, having taken time to put together deliverables or presentation materials and do my best to say, this is my concept, and this is why I did it, and then give you the opportunity to either say yes or no. But the design process, at least in the old world, maybe now with CAD and with all these three-dimensional programs, you can put a lot of fluff up there with a lot of detail at the use permit phase. But again, the process is soliciting a use permit based upon some program that some client or consultant team's putting together. Once that's granted, then that allows the design team to move forward with confidence that they're going to be successful. So that's my 2 cents.
Can I respond to that? I don't think our charge is to design the project, but our charge as the planning process's charge is to approve the design of a project. And in my view, I don't think the process leads to effective approval of design, because to Commissioner McDonald and other commissioners' points, we approve the boxes, we approve the site layout, and it gets to design review, and a critical part of design review, especially when it comes to architectural design, for example, is being able to potentially modify those boxes a little. I mean, a Spanish-style pitch or design could be different than a modern style versus a Craftsman. I mean, it's in my view, sort of, and again, this is from real-world experience. We, in my view, have never spent more than 10 minutes really hammering, 10 to 15 minutes hammering down a design of a, to Commissioner McDonald's point earlier, large scale over a certain standard project, because those projects are so well rendered and so well designed. Let's take the Altamira apartments, for example. It was all here before you. And so, in my view, I think, and to your point earlier, you're right, you haven't seen many projects yet that have all those materials, but they exist in the sort of modern technology, whether it's CAD or whatever you want to call it, they exist. And so I think it would actually be more efficient and be more effective if the Planning Commission weighed in on the design. And by the way, if you looked at the different options, that doesn't mean it has to be all during that hearing. There could be, to your suggestion, a planning commission subcommittee that meets before, that signs off on design. I do know this happens in many other cities, and it seems to work well and be effective in many other cities. And so what I have seen just from personal experience is I don't think the process works very well here. And I think that it could actually be not only more efficient, but provide more effectively designed approvals.
And if I could steal a phrase from your last presentation, I respectfully disagree with you. And I am in the real world, the realistic world of the design process. And we have, as I've exhibited, both sitting as a commissioner here, as well as a design review commissioner, as well as an applicant standing trying to justify my work. We do, you may not say it consciously, but I have witnessed making designing decisions from here to that applicant. And that's not our role. Yes, our role is to approve the design, but there's a whale of a difference between approving design and doing the design. Our charge is not to do the design. Our charge is to evaluate the design, its appropriateness, and make a decision based upon that. And I disagree with your statement that says in design review that a design review should be able to change massing significantly. If
I didn't say significantly, I said an inch you can't change.
well, that's a hyperbole. That's a hyperbole that is not grounded in reality.
No, that's true.
No, you're wrong.
That's a fact. You cannot change a building height by an inch at design review. Am I correct?
Well, I hope consistently advise people, including, applicants and members of the Design Review Commission, is that once a project has come out of the Planning Commission, assuming it's gone through the Planning Commission, through the use permit process or whatever, but let's just call it a use permit, that well, it's just a fine line. For example, the Design Review Commission could not approve a greater height, okay? And they couldn't approve a lesser setback. If working with the applicants, they managed to agree on, a height reduction or a greater setback, that's okay. But the Design Review Commission can't, lop off a story or, reduce the number of units.
But the applicant would have to agree.
Yeah, I think.
'Cause I just never seen that happen.
Right. Well, I'm not going to, I don't question your experience on the Design Review Commission. I do not. So I will say that it's probably pretty rare that comes up.
I just want to clarify, I guess, what I was trying to say. And the fact is, I agree with Ron. I believe that it is, we need to provide more trust in the designer that's coming before us, and we also are also equally responsible to making sure that there's clarity and that things can get approved consistently. But the question is raised is when we're in a public hearing and people are questioning the general plan consistency and community standards with respect to compatibility with adjoining developments. And we are in a public hearing where there's discussion about reducing the heights of buildings and setbacks. And we are, as a commission, having to be the moderators of that and also provide constructive feedback for staff to be able to modify or bring a project back or to establish conditions. That in those instances, I think it would be very helpful for us to have a peer review process where there's an independent person that is looking at the bulk the compatibility, all the standards that are set for us as a commission to make sure that we're approving a project that's consistent with the general plan. And now we're looking at design standards for different zones of our city. So we're going to have an extra added layer that we have that we're going to be responsible for making findings on. And my only constructive feedback is that it would be really helpful that when projects come before our commission, that there is an independent peer review for larger projects that provide constructive feedback and help, and that would only help the commission look at a project with another designer's eyes, independent from the project architect, and that if there's some suggestions that could be made, that those could be provided to the commission, and they can look and decide whether or not those suggestions are helpful. And specifically, I remember at several public hearings, the call was to reduce the size and the scale and break up the size of buildings. And we had asked the developer to come back, and nothing had changed. And we had to have another public hearing and to be able to vet that out. It would have been very helpful to have a design colleague to be able to say, you know, we looked at that, we looked at the comments, and these are our suggestions for making changes to the project. It's only to prevent, I'm only trying to think of ways to be able to reduce the amount of public hearings, to help David and staff be able to provide recommendations at a public hearing, saying these are some recommendations that could possibly be used to improve the design, and then let our commission make a decision on approving a project quicker and giving those conditions or suggestions to the design review commission, so then they can take those constructive that constructive feedback, and then work with them in their commission, where they're the ones that are responsible for ultimately looking at those final details, and then let the commission then just be able to approve, modify, or condition those projects with, in certain instances of a certain size, having those that peer review. The Altamira project was really, really painful because we had so many public hearings, and we were working so hard to make changes on that design so we would get some general consensus with the community. I think ultimately we did. I think we did a really good job. We did improve the design of that project. We broke those buildings up. We made them into smaller units. We reduced the height. But that was a really painful process, and I think we could have done a lot better for that developer, and we could have done a better service to the community by creating a better streamlined process, so we wouldn't have had so many public hearings to address those bulk and community compatibility issues. I'm not talking about colors. I'm not talking about eaves. I'm not talking about Spanish versus contemporary. I'm talking about sheer bulk, size, and massing. We were able to achieve a lot, but that was a very painful process. So,
A comment, Commissioner McDonald, regarding the peer review. We may have, if you saw the council's appeal for Shotgun Hill, there was a good example of what I call peer review or professional debate. So those that were appealing the commission's approval, you had one civil engineer saying oranges, then you had the original civil engineer saying apples. I'm not sure that sitting up at the council, hearing, you know, the differences between two, quote, professionals. The problem with what you've just described is sometimes that peer review person, it has not been party to all the program details, all the expectations of the client, what they're trying to achieve. And to have a peer simply come in and kind of look at it, I'm not sure it sounds good. It sounds like it's also giving us a deflection, because then all of a sudden we can kind of gravitate to what the peer says rather than, in essence, kind of do our work. I don't think that supports it. And if in the Altamira process, if comments were made, the applicant chose not to respond to the comments, the commissioners still felt very strong about those comments, that's the applicant's screw up. That's the applicant's fault for then having to come back, because either A, he didn't want to do it, B, he didn't think you were, that they could sneak it through or whatever. But that's on the applicant if he had to come back a third or the fourth time. So again, I'm not sure, maybe we need more discussion, but I don't hear the validity of having another peer review to help us make the decision on.
Maybe this is, and I know this is really frustrating, but I'm glad we're talking about this. Maybe we're looking at it on the wrong platform. Maybe what we should be looking at is helping staff like David, give him the ability to hire an architectural consultant to work with an applicant before it comes to us. Some sort of process that allows staff to help give them guidance to work with applicants, so we get better projects. And maybe it is where when I worked as an urban planner, we would hire an architect to help us understand whether or not a project was ready, and we would bring a project before our planning commission, and it would be the way they wanted it, and we would have an architect's comments that were supported by staff in making changes, and then it was up to the commission to decide whether or not they felt they wanted to go in staff's direction or approve the project as submitted by the applicant. I mean, maybe we're looking at the wrong platform. Maybe that's what.
And well, I just want to go off on this peer review discussion. I mean, it's not our role to design the project, so I do agree with you, Commissioner Wellender. But it is our role to approve the design, and to approve the design, especially now in this downtown district, we have downtown design guidelines. So in some respect, our current development code, through these downtown design guidelines, do sort of create a role, not necessarily to design the specifics of a project, but we have to sort of follow these guidelines. And the problem with that is David interprets those guidelines. And with all due respect, David's not an architect. We interpret those guidelines, but we're not architects. And so what I think Commissioner McDonald is saying, it might be helpful for David and staff to provide that sort of outside expertise, that professional expertise, to say whether or not this project is conforming with design guidelines that are part of our development code.
I just want to throw in a couple of things. First, it's important to remember that this is a discussion item about whether there's interest in this topic, and clearly there is, and which is great. Second, we're not going to design a new process tonight, so we don't need to try either. I think it's good to get, your kind of philosophical positions out on the table, because that is going to be helpful and necessary moving forward. But that said, to the extent that there is interest in looking at this item, there'll be other opportunities to, have further discussions on these questions. Just a couple of, points from my perspective. If those downtown design guidelines require an architect to interpret, then, to me, that is a problem. They were not designed to require an architect to interpret. They were designed to allow you to reach conclusions about whether or not a project conforms with the design guidelines or not. That's ultimately your call, not mine. Second, again, in terms of these different options that Commissioner Barnett came forward with, I feel like the option of having a pre-review by the Design Review and Historic Preservation Commission has a lot of merit in my mind, and I think again may not be fully responsive to Commissioner McDonald's idea about a peer review, but it brings in a voice from the community, but at the same time, they're members of the community who were appointed as having, expertise in these different areas and training in these different areas, because they do get training. And so I feel like that might be, a way forward, through that debate. And then just lastly, with respect to Altamira, no one project can be or should be used as the reason to change our system, and I don't think that Altamira presents any kind of big reason to change our system. I think that there are just always reasons to kind of look at how we practice this process and look for ways to improve it and think about different options. There's never, we should always be trying to do that. But with respect to Altamira, again, just not to totally rehash it, but they came before you in a study session. You directed that they make some changes to their site plan. They did. They came back to you at the beginning of the environmental review process. One of the comments was that their architecture, was too, dry, for lack of a better term, and the building heights needed to be lowered. Well, guess what? They came back with reduced building heights and, their take on an updated architecture. They had to go through one more try with the Planning Commission when it came time for the use permit to be reviewed. I don't think that is a failure. I think that's, if you are going to be looking at design issues carefully, then that's going to be kind of normal, that there are going to be, questions and feedback about design at that phase of the project review. And if an applicant has to come back to make changes, I don't view that as, a failure in the process. That is the process. So I feel like I don't view the Altamira project as, unsuccessful in terms of, a representative of particular or emblematic of problems of our review process. But again, that's not to say that we shouldn't.
Well, I just want to say that is not why I brought this forward.
I totally understand that that's not why you put this on the agenda. It just
Frustrations
came up as part of the discussion.
The
That's all.
design review,
Yeah.
right? I will say, just in terms of that, why I did bring Altamira up was, from what I remember, and again, I wasn't on the commission at the time, Commissioner McDonald brought up specific changes he wanted, and they were not implemented. And so the question then is, would he have supported the project? And so, because we have this disjointed process, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, I'm just saying it seemed like a disjointed process to me. And so when the project, when Saha came back and said, well, we can't do X, Y, and Z that Commissioner McDonald suggested because of X, Y, and Z, or A, B, and C, or whatever, he wasn't there on the other side to sort of have that discussion. It was like a whole brand new set of people. And it just, to me, that seemed not to be like a very
Yeah,
effective.
I get that criticism. Yeah.
And I want to be clear. I thought that the process was good. I'm not suggesting that what we did could have been better. I think, and I said that I thought we were very successful in making some significant changes to the bulk and size. It was a painful process to get to that point, but it was successful. And I guess my only disappointment was that my recommendations that were supposed to be added as conditions weren't implemented. And that ultimately, and I agree with Ron, that is ultimately up to the Design Review Commission to make those calls. And so, because that's what their role is. And so I respect what they did. I'm disappointed. I was hoping that they would use those, but I'm not sorry for the process up to that point, or even the decision by that commission. But I think we can all agree that if there is a way to make it easier for the designers and make it easier for staff to provide guidance when it comes to issues with respect to compatibility, bulk, community standards, and neighborhood compatibility, if there's anything that we can do to help staff or to help our commission when we're going through these public hearings, we should be thinking about that as part of the design review process, either on the end of the design review commission or on the planning commission. So I agree with Commissioner Barnett that we should be talking about this. But I also agree with Commissioner Wallender's frustration, because ultimately a designer does have a client that he's designing for. And so the bigger question is whether or not our commission agrees with the direction of the client, not the designer per se, but.
Before I want to give the public a chance to weigh in. Patricia's been very patient, and we could go on quite a while, but I think that we
No
won't.
more. I'll be
We
quick.
won't.
You know, I think one of the problems that I've seen, because oftentimes I come to both the Planning Commission and Design Review, sometimes the plans that get to Design Review are different than the ones that are approved at Planning Commission. And also, and I understand Ron's frustration also. You know, I think that neither the Planning Commission nor the Design Review need to design for the client or for the designer, but there are things that can be done. I think story polls are essential, because then the neighborhood, everybody sees it, and it's not one story poll that's up for an hour, which I have to say I've seen, or they fall over, that has to be, they have to be professionally done, and they have to be up enough so the neighborhood sees what's there. I think that the suggestion that David supported of having Design Review have some input in the beginning, I think that as designers, not as professionals rather, there are things that are not caught, and I need to ask David a question, if you don't mind.
That's all right.
With the MacArthur Place project, there were, because I went to both meetings, David, there were, did you know that there was a tall wall on the west side of the whole property?
Well, I'm just going to say that was not a I'm not the staff person for that project,
Okay.
so I'm not familiar with the details of that project.
Okay, so it was quite a surprise at Design Review that there was a large wall on the west side of the buildings, and it had not been brought up. That's quite a significant feature of the project, and it's going to go all the way around on MacArthur Street. So it's not, I'm not criticizing that, but I'm just mentioning that was not considered in any of the, it was just mentioned. And the other thing that I noticed, and this is where I think a professional would help, is that project went through the whole process, including the approval of parking with you guys. And the stormwater retention was not dealt with at any point. That's going to be dealt with afterwards. That may change the parking configuration that you approved. I just think that having a bit more oversight sometimes would be helpful, because these are the issues that I'm seeing, compliance issues that just kind of by the time it gets to Design Review, I think that Mr. Barnett's comment was that it's pretty much done, except for a lot of the colors and some of the other elements. So that's just my personal opinion. It's not a criticism of anyone, but I think that the process could be better for everybody, and that's it.
Thank you, Patricia. I don't really think that we need to carry this much further tonight. I just like to chime in with a couple things. First of all, I do think that there are certainly things we can do to improve the process, and I tend to agree with a lot of the commission viewpoint that some at least preliminary design review would be appropriate before it comes to Planning Commission for a final approval. But I also respect Commissioner Wellander's opinion that you don't want to put a burden on the applicant to go through some final design before you even get the use permit granted. So I think there has to be some moderation of both sides of that picture, and perhaps it requires a couple of trips to design review. But I think that's things that we ought to consider, and I think we ought to continue this discussion at a future time if we can have maybe some concrete proposals presented.
Well, I think as the next step, I'm going to take this item to the Design Review and Historic Preservation Commission and hear their feedback.
Yeah, that'd be good.
And then come back to you once that's done.
Appreciate that.
I do have a couple of questions and one comment, okay? If the process were reversed and projects went to the Design Review Commission before they came to the Planning Commission, would there not be, when it comes to what the staff review is, it's still going to have to meet all the setbacks, it's going to have to meet the building heights, it's going to have to meet the zoning requirements, et cetera, before it went to that body. Is that not correct?
Well, it depends on whether or not it was done as a pre-application review. If it was a pre-application review, then maybe not all of those issues would be resolved. If it was something that occurred after the filing of the application, then they would certainly need to be in substantial compliance with code requirements, and they would also need to, have identified any areas where they needed an exception or, whatever modification to the standards. So that would need to be known up front.
Is a pre-application review elective on the part of
Currently,
Okay. So basically, the only real problem with taking it to design review and having that input before the Planning Commission is that they would not yet have their approvals for the use permit or whatever it is that they were seeking prior to making that submittal to the design review.
well, and presumably that's not even a flaw. I mean, it would be an opportunity for early feedback from the Design
agree.
Review Commission that would help inform the subsequent review by the Planning Commission.
Okay, I think we're going to wind this one up then. We got another item on the agenda for discussion, and I'm not so sure where we want to go with this one.
I would just like to say that over the last couple of months, it has been a very busy time for the Planning Department and therefore for the Planning Commission. And as a result of that, there have been too many occasions where materials have been delivered to you late, which is a burden on you and on the public. And again, I do apologize for that. I feel like we are in a place right now where we can get away from that particular trend. It's not something that we want to do. So I think moving forward, we're going to be able to do a better job of getting you materials in the manner and time in which they are required. We've
in that regard,
with it, you and I, the chair of the Planning Commission, have had some discussion about just saying, you know what, if it can't be ready at a certain time, then we just don't have the hearing, and that is certainly always an option.
unless there's some extenuating circumstances or some legal requirements where we must
Sure,
go ahead.
sure.
But I think we should have at least a standard cutoff of when we would get materials so that both we and the public have an opportunity to properly review them.
I agree with that.
Okay. If you don't really have much more feedback on this item,
I just had one question, and I know it came up, but I can't remember if it was conclusively resolved. But by the same token, is there an opportunity to cut the public comment off at a certain period of time so that we're not like 2 hours before the meeting getting 40 new pages of correspondence? I mean, is it 24 hours in advance or so? I mean, I realize you got to give the public time to respond, but just as we, is it just impossible to do that?
It's simply not legally possible to do that. I think that, well, and I know that members of the public are, they're sincerely engaged in this process. And, there's nothing usually, 9 times out of 10 anyway, about it that is, intended to be, I feel like for the most part, the things that happen in terms of public comment are done in good faith. And if someone comes in with 40 pages at the last minute, it's because it typically was a last minute thing. But the person who finds himself in that position, has to understand that the commission may not have time to completely read and digest their comments, and that's just the way it is. But there is no way to establish a cutoff like that.
Can I ask a question, though, to that? So it isn't legal to say that public comment needs to be at City Hall by noon the day of the commissions, and if it's not that they can't express their thoughts, but then they're obligated to read it here. Because, again, if you are expecting us to take information seriously at the last minute, it would be better for them to say, if they really had a heartfelt comments to share, and then they don't meet it by noon on the day of the hearing, it seems like their obligation is, it's not they can't speak, but their obligation is they need to come to the podium and read.
Well, that can be hard with a 3-minute time limit. So,
Read fast.
I understand the frustration about that, but it's a legal matter. We can't have a cutoff. Someone could walk in right now with a phone book on this item because it's on the agenda and it's an opportunity for public comment. But again, just as a practical matter, the commission's not going to be able to read and digest that information. So, it just
I think
becomes
the
a
important
counterproductive
thing
practice.
here
Yeah.
is for us to do
Right.
do our job and get the material
Right.
out to the public in a timely
Yeah.
fashion so that they have time to
Right.
respond. If they choose not to respond till the last minute, then they're taking that risk.
Right.
Right. And as to David's point, as a practical matter, you generally distribute public comment maybe early afternoon via digitally. And so if it comes in after that, you just put it here in front of us. And, if you don't want to read it, you don't have to read it. I mean, I just wouldn't want to send a message to the public that we want to cut off your input.
But the problem with that is that, so let's
Mike.
play that one out. If you don't want to read it, you don't read it. Well, that's the craps, because we have an obligation.
Oh, I agree. You should read it. But
Yeah, but again, read it with the intent of being able to be thoughtful about it.
No, I agree
That's
with
where
that.
my other criticism is that, good, bad, or indifferent, some of us aren't retired, and so, when you do yeoman's work to get prepared, and I love the information that you gave me, but I got ticked as anything that I got it at 4 o'clock or 3:30. Did I have a chance to really sit there and thoughtfully go through it and really give serious consideration? No. Is it my fault? Am I being negligent? I don't think so. And that's where why can't the public be a little bit more considerate of us?
Well, I totally understand the frustration, but it's, and I think that most people do try to be considerate.
I have a comment. I guess it's going to be honed into CEQA, and when we're reviewing initial studies, and the public has so many days to comment. I mean, Maybe refresh my mind, because I haven't had to process an initial study and a negative declaration, but there are certain time limitations and cutoffs that somebody can comment on an environmental document. Is that correct?
Well, that is correct, but let's look at how it actually works. We publish an initial study. We circulate it for comment. Typically, it's a 30-day comment period. But that comment period, you know, again, as a practical matter, is an agency comment period. Because we've got to bring it to you, the Planning Commission, in a public hearing. That's a publicly noticed hearing where people get to comment on the item at the public hearing. So that typically happens a little outside of the comment window, because we want to get all of the agency comments before you hold your public hearing. So maybe it's like 5 days after the comment period closed for the agencies. But it's a public hearing. Someone can walk into that public hearing and say what they have to say. They can deliver a letter to you. They can do any of those things because it is a public hearing.
I guess so I'm honing in just on CEQA and CEQA issues and us being able to make findings. When somebody comes in and slaps an alternate traffic study on us at the last minute, when we're having to make findings about traffic, and those have bearing over the ultimate findings that we have to make, whether or not something can be approved as a negative declaration as opposed to an EIR. I think maybe that's kind of where we can all agree that that's where there's the frustration, when we all have to review something that we know we have to make the findings with respect to CEQA.
Well, and again, just as a practical matter, you can say to that person who gave that to you, even though there was this, you know, longer opportunity to provide it, this wasn't provided in a timely way, and we really can't rely on it in terms of making findings for this project.
Okay.
Well, and that's where we're trying to establish a reasonable cutoff for the more formal materials that come to us, and if we make the decision that they didn't get here in time, we'll cancel the hearing.
Oh, I see where you're going. Okay, yeah. Like you would, at the last public hearing, we were making a decision whether we should continue it and digest or.
I mean, and presumably we would even do that in advance of the actual hearing date. If we don't meet the cutoff, the item will be canceled or postponed.
And I would just like the opportunity to, you know, have further discussions with you about
Right.
how that works.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Yeah,
we have
but
to,
yeah,
we
just
have
in
to
general,
fine-tune
yeah.
the actual
Right.
procedure,
Right.
but we're trying to make this the best we can for both the commission and the public, so that we have the adequate time to review the projects.
Right. Thanks.
To the chair,
Yes.
you'll be thrilled to know that I actually have more comments on this particular item than the other two. And I sense, you know, that, and I would include myself 100%, we all just want to get out of here. I just don't want it tabled. I would like to see this item come before the commission. I think other commissioners have raised, you know, very diverse issues of what mine are, okay? But the long and the short of it is, I don't want it to just go away and we not actually have an open discussion as he had on the other two discussion items on this. And I would like legal counsel to be here when we do it.
I want to hear what she has to say before I go home. No, I'm not kidding. I want to know where everything is now.
Can you do it in a reasonable time period?
Oh, I think so. I can read pretty fast.
Okay.
Okay.
Because I don't want to dismiss your idea of having further discussion on this
Right,
in the
we
future.
are, so.
Okay. All right. First of all, I think that one of the things that could be improved, and I'm talking about the information flow to the public and to the commission, okay, could be improved by changing the applicant's role in the public hearing process, okay? And by that I mean that right now they come and they make the presentation, then people from the audience speak to it, okay? Sometimes there's misconceptions. unwittingly. There's no question about it. But the long and the short of it is, there's not an opportunity then for the applicant to respond to anything that was said, or for us to easily ask questions of the applicant. We have to make the statement, I have a question for the applicant, I have a question for staff, kind of thing. I think all we have to do is after all the testimony's been taken from the public, have the applicant come back up, be there to respond if he or she chooses, to respond to anything that was stated, okay? And then also for that person to stay there so that we can ask questions, which about 90% of the questions you have at that point are really more aimed appropriately to the applicant. And I think that would be a way to improve the flow of information. Now, if the applicant raises something that someone from the public wants to re-raise, yes, that could add some time, and I understand that, and that would have to be accommodated. I understand that too. But I think we're losing. I watch the frustration of some of the people that, have made the applications in the audience, and they hear something and they know it's wrong, or they know it's not, it's a misunderstanding, and yet they can't respond to it, and they have no opportunity after that to do so. That's my suggestion, okay, on that one. And I think I think when we have legal questions that might come up, we should have legal counsel here. Finally, we have, and I think it's important to note, because we have a contracted attorney. We don't have a city attorney, and I think that's part of it, and I recognize it's a budgetary issue, because they're paid when they come, and they're not paid when they don't, I presume. Is that correct, David? Okay. So I think, however, there are certain times, and especially like on some of the discussion items that we had on here tonight, where legal counsel would have been important, especially in this particular one, okay? And if what is in the packet on Friday, and I don't know whether this is possible to do, if the packets that we receive and what the public would receive, which is all the same ball of wax, they get what we get, correct? Okay? If it's not in there and additional information has to be provided, why not just continue the item? We didn't open a hearing, but we heard yes, we did open a hearing. We heard all kinds of public testimony on an item that was stated after the staff presentation was going to be continued. We'll hear it all again when it comes back, and we all know that. And I think it was a single item agenda. And I think it was a phenomenal waste of time on everybody's part, especially the public's, because they're the ones that have to leave their kids and their families and everything else and come out here just to make a statement about a project that is near them or that they care about, okay? All right.
I
Then
get it.
the other thing, the reports in the agenda, it says, one of the things that I have a problem is that there's no summary report, especially on the larger projects. A one-page summary, it's very simple to do, okay, that basically describes it, and then also what generally is being recommended by staff and so forth would be very, very helpful, okay? Secondly, if it's continued, which has happened on a number of occasions, what happens is that it's hard to track what has changed and what has not. Very difficult. And I know that I've called and asked David a couple of times, and I think that if we had a summary report on these planning commission items that both the public and the planning commission would be able to see, and then any changes that occurred from the last time it was heard to what we're seeing on that particular evening. Just those changes, not another 25 pages of conditions of approval and staff reporting and everything else. Just the changes, okay, would be extremely helpful and easier, so you're not going back and slogging through all the rest of the reporting just to see what, if anything, had changed, okay? And, okay?
Can I just say something
Sure.
about that? I have to do legal documents all the time for my big regattas, and they change. And in order for you to keep track of the legal document, because it has to go to judges, it has to go to a number of people, I always date them, And whenever there's a revision, I redate it, but I only put the amendment with the date and what the wording was to what it has changed. And that goes on a single piece of paper, and that gets legally posted on the notice board. And it works, so you don't get confused.
I totally agree. I think there's an easier way to present this information for the ease of the public in particular and for us.
And you're not talking about David's resolutions and changes to environmental documents where there's underscored lines and additions. You're talking about the actual staff report that talks about on April 19th, we had a public hearing. These 10 things were raised about the project. The commission suggested making changes X, Y, and Z. The project's now changed by A, B, and C, and here are the changes.
Staff
Is that-
report, conditions of approval, but anything substantive related to our review of it and what we're going to decide upon.
Right, so the summary would talk about the last meeting, what the issues were, what recommended changes were to be made, and then the actual changes that were made and highlighting those in a summary.
Yes, and I think the summary should come with the initial report on anything that's more than 3 pages long. You have a summary, and then the next one comes out, and if it changes, it changes. If it doesn't, it doesn't. All I need is to see no change. I'm a happy camper, you know, or staff recommends the following amendment to condition number 3. That's all I want to see. I don't need to see all the rest of them reprinted, redone, okay?
Well, I know David does a really good job on all the resolutions and the findings and the environmental documents. Those are all like really detailed out. So when we get a revised document at another meeting, those are all,
Well,
they're all done the way you're talking about. Like they're all like, you know what's been changed and what's been hatched out.
And the date.
And the date. Well, I don't know about the date.
And
I
I-
even put the time.
But I think that David, that you've made you make a very good attempt at providing a new summary when there's a continued project, because you do write a new staff report. It talks about what's happened before and what's coming now.
Well, I try to, but at the same time, you know, I take your suggestion, and I think that are ways to just hone it in better.
Okay.
Happy to hear that suggestion.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I only had
One more?
Yeah, just 2, okay? The continuances, and I have to defer to David on this, continuance of items that have already been heard or presented at least to the Planning Commission and the public, okay? Are they customarily then put on the agenda first before other items, other new items?
Customarily, but there are exceptions to that rule, as we'll see on the next agenda.
And the reason for the exceptions are what? Why wouldn't something that was continued and already had a hearing not have the courtesy of being first on the agenda?
Other one's shorter, maybe?
Well, as Commissioner Barnett just said, the other one might be a short, simple item that can just be taken care of. But in the specific example of Gateway versus this study session issue, those are going to be the 2 items on this upcoming agenda. The study session is going to be the first item on the agenda because, and this is convoluted, but, you know, I want to answer your question. So that study session had previously been scheduled. The applicants called us up. I can't remember what day it was. It might have been the Friday that the packet was going to go out, and said to us, we want to make a change in our site plans. We would like to pull this item from the agenda. And so we said yes. And then we heard from them again on Monday saying, oh, well, we made this change. Can we still be on the agenda? And I mean, you know, in one sense they are on the agenda, but this was already an agenda that seemed pretty full to me. It was already an agenda where I was giving the commission things late, and I didn't want to add to the fullness of the agenda or add to the things that I was giving you late. So I said to the applicants, no, I don't want to do that. We've already told the planning commission you're not going to be on the agenda, but just as a courtesy, I'm going to put you first on the next agenda.
Just to make a comment, I don't agree with that. And I think any study session items, to my understanding, are not even a paid application.
That's true.
I cannot imagine hearing an unpaid application over a paid application that's been continued to a date certain. Okay, finally, the single item agendas where continuance is recommended for the meeting should be canceled, not heard, not the staff report read, not anything from my perspective, okay? And simply cancel the meeting. If it's one item on the agenda, why wouldn't we just have canceled the meeting, have somebody out there, have a notice on the door, somebody's out there from planning, and said, the meeting's not going to be held because the only item that was to be heard has been taken off the agenda. I don't think anybody would have minded not sitting here for 3 hours to listen to all of the comments and then go back and know that they're going to have to come back and do them all over again.
I was under the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, David, that if an agenda item is, or if it's agendized, you have to you can't just cancel the meeting, right? You have to literally open it and.
Actually, the meeting could be canceled. It could be canceled, but there are a couple of issues, especially when it is a single item agenda, all right? So if we're talking about the gateway agenda, let's talk about that. First, I don't regard personally that meeting as a waste of time because we got a lot of different feedback from the planning commission and the public on design issues. So that feedback was useful to staff and useful to the applicant, and I don't think that project, even if that other last minute issue had cropped up, I think that we would be in a situation where we're holding 2 hearings on that project. And so we got one of those hearings out of the way. Second, if it is a single item agenda and that item is canceled, then we're renoticing it for, whatever the next time comes up. And that's, the luck of the draw. I mean, that can happen. But we wouldn't have had an opportunity to continue it to the regular meeting in May because we wouldn't have been able to do the notice. It would have come up probably in late May or June. So there are just some practical kind of just procedural wrinkles associated with canceling a single item meeting, but we've done that and we can do that, and I'm sure we will do that.
Is it my understanding that when we hear that item again, that the public hearing will be opened again? And the same people who spoke at the last public hearing, even though we did not consider the item, will be able to speak again, correct?
That's right.
I think we should always encourage public input.
I totally agree.
Why, it just seems
I
like
just don't
we're.
know whether we want to pull them out and have them do it again and again and again.
I understand,
I think we'll conclude this item. Are there any other comments from the commission? I thought there was going to be one, but I can't remember what it was anymore.
I was inviting the Visitors Bureau to make a presentation to the Planning
Oh, yeah.
Commission.
Yeah, okay. With that, I would take a motion for adjournment.
I so move.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Adjourned.
And I should also want our commission to thank David for listening to this. I know it's helpful, but it's also kind of, it's hard.
It's worth doing, and I appreciate
Yes.
all of the time that you put into this. Thank you.